approaches to compliance. So there are different methods of compliance, and so having someone who's familiar with the energy rating process would be a, you know, a good consultant to have. And there's got to be a few of them around.
This was certainly one of the pieces of advice we got from Chris Burns in Burlington, was that we could do a contract basis inspection rather than going full, set up an office
Yeah.
and hire full-time staff path.
Yeah, Jeff Forward, he's out in Richmond. He suggested the same thing in one of the RB's meetings, that that would be an interim approach, but just not saying that you're doing any inspection would be a mistake.
Certainly my
but-
experience in Burlington was that the contractors who worked on my house in Burlington made a lot of complaints about how they were going to have to do things differently because someone was actually going to come out and check their work.
Mhm.
So it seemed pretty clear to me that they weren't already following the code,
Right.
and they were just happy that, oh, this will be trivial. No, they were like, oh, I got to do it the right way.
Right.
Or-
And if every homeowner was an expert, it's like, yeah, my house, Homestead did a pretty amazing job. They're using different contractors, it's the different subs and stuff like that. But if they know somebody's looking and that you're going to have a blower door test and that there's somebody knows what they're talking about, the builders will do what they need to do as long as they can charge for that work.
I think, though, to get back to your point, Srini, I think the political process as it is, the steps that the city would have to go through to make this occur, I think you'd have to focus on the ordinance first and getting that passed before you start developing the mechanism for enforcement, because you don't know if it's going to pass or not. And you wouldn't want to put a whole lot of resources into working on the enforcement until it passes. And it's a big public process, and it may or may not.
If you're making a recommendation to the city council, I would like to think that the city council would want to understand what is involved in making this ordinance happen. That's the
That's
I'm
fair.
asking the question from
Yeah.
the point of view of the resident. If this ordinance comes along,
Mhm.
then what is the city exactly going to do? Is it just a piece of paper?
I'm not following the question. The city is also not an expert in the residential energy structure code. And the city's not an expert in electrical systems. The city's not an expert in plumbing codes. All those are on the books or all the law. This would be another thing on the books.
Well, we do have actually electrical inspection, just to be clear.
For
on that.
single family homes?
Not for single,
Right,
but
that's
we
what I'm
also
saying.
don't have any regulations regarding.
But the state does.
And also doesn't do inspection. I
I'm
mean,
just
frankly,
saying that there's lots of laws
permitting
on the
mechanism At
books.
the state level.
There's lots of laws on the books about how you have to build a home. And the city doesn't inspect for any of that.
The other way of looking at it is that that's a stronger argument for why having an
I
inspection
don't
would-
disagree.
would
As we've
be-
said, we've recommended there should be an inspection system. But again, my strong perspective here is it should be divorced from getting this ordinance on the books.
Well, there's steps. I mean, there are definitely steps. So I agree with you that, just for the sake of, how do you get something like this done? That's the first step, but understanding that the second step, there's a second and a third step there too. There's another step that you haven't mentioned, and that's requiring a certificate of occupancy
Yeah, I
for
was gonna
single
ask
family
about
homes. Because the state, various municipalities and have found out that there's no way that you can enforce anything if you can't withhold something. And if it doesn't meet the code, you can still do a certificate of occupancy, but it would have to be a conditional,
Right.
and it just would state right in there that this building does not meet energy code and cannot be sold until it passes the energy code. Because you can build your own house and you don't have to meet the code. You just can't sell that house.
But again, we're
legally.
kind of talking about two different things here. You're talking about the entire energy code, and I'm really just focused on this ordinance.
Yeah, no,
Well, it doesn't make sense to do one without the other.
Sure it
though.
does.
No, it does.
Well, but in steps you can do it. It's just, I
Yeah.
think, Andrew, that's fine. We could do that as the first step. And we don't want to get to the second step if we can't get the first step done, as you said already. So yes, you want to do the first step, but you want to be prepared to answer questions about step two, because they will inevitably come up.
Right. Well, I think, if I can just jump in here, I think step one is building a case for council.
Right.
This
of
is not an
course.
automatic. The council will take a major step to disconnect fossil fuels, there will be a big pushback from certainly at least the industry on this. And so being prepared for what is involved, what will this mean? What will this mean to housing costs, affordability? And then whether it's on day one or later, what would a potential game plan be for enforcing that? And then council will choose whether to do that or not. But I suspect, and I don't want to put Helen on the spot, but for council to make a decision of this scale and be one of the first municipalities in the state of Vermont and across the country to require this will probably take some substantial argument preparation.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
although,
I don't want to
I
sort
don't
of
think we
leave
would
the,
be-
in 2 weeks' time, council's going to warn a hearing to adopt this. I
Yeah.
think that there's some heavy lifting, and I think that how we get to that is a next challenging question.
I hope it won't be as heavy as you indicate, Paul. We got our neighbor city that's done it. You know, the science indicates we need to do it, but okay.
well, to be clear, there are certainly lots of other cities around the
Yeah,
country
absolutely,
that have mandated net zero homes.
absolutely.
Net zero by definition means no fossil fuel.
I think we're
use.
behind the curve, honestly.
So we wouldn't be new, but it is less common in colder, less sunny climates. So,
I understand the need to do it. The questions I'm asking is to figure out, how do you convince the decision makers? What do you need to show to them? That's where the scope comes in. What is involved? So to Paul's comments, I don't think the city council is going to say, yes, go ahead, do it.
No, but so that's why we have the science-based targets, right? Those targets assume, right, it's 11% homes have to be converted and all new homes have to be net zero to get to the
Rena,
target.
can you make sure you have your mic on when you speak?
I'm not even talking about the target. This is the first time we are actually talking about this, discussing
No.
this.
I don't think so, but
Sorry,
okay.
can I finish? I feel like this is Paul has sent out 2 memos. All of us have read it. There needs to be a discussion. So I don't know how we just jump to, just going to do about an ordinance. Let's understand the scope of what needs to be done. That's the questions I'm asking. If this is not the forum, then let's find a forum to do
No,
that.
so, no, go ahead, ask your question, Serena. I'm not,
No, then let's not bypass stuff. I'm asking the question, what is the scope? How are we going to convince the stakeholders? So Paul just reiterated that it's going to be a process to present a business case. What is involved in developing the details of what this ordinance is going to do? What is the scope of the work? How are we going to define that? Is that body of work on us? Is that body of work on Paul? So let's just think about the process.
So Srini, are you saying what exactly are we going to put in our written recommendation to the city council?
Exactly.
Okay, all right. And I would just like to second, as the person who represents affordable housing in this group, that I concur with Paul. There is going to be pushback, both from the Affordable Housing Committee and from the Economic Development Committee. We have heard these things where we talked about the ARPA money, and they would not go for requiring net zero. The best I could convince that committee was to give extra points to applicants who approach net zero. That was the best argument.
well,
It wasn't even a requirement. It was just,
and look also at what Burlington did. They don't say that you can't use natural gas. They said,
yeah, right.
right, so be careful there, because in commercial buildings, there are projects where you cannot get to net zero.
Right.
Like this building apparently couldn't quite get there. But you can use, but at least 85% of the heating has to be done fossil free.
So I think that one of the things to think about to get all the stakeholders to agree, like affordable housing, is to set up, to do some research on it. And that, you'll probably have to hand it off to back to Paul and probably back to the city manager to do the research on this. But there's ways to mitigate the problems, like, other large municipalities that have these types of ordinances, they have exceptions. They have either long time frames for complying or they have exceptions for affordable housing. They have certain thresholds. And I think Burlington has some of those as well.
No, they don't, not in this ordinance.
Yeah.
No. So
They
look,
do
the
have
research,
It's an alternative compliance payment.
right, if you, over 25 years at $100 a ton, but right, I mean, that's a big number. But I mean, we did the research, right, in the energy committee, we pulled up tons of studies in cold climates, which show that over some period of time, 3-5 years, it's, for new construction, it's the same cost for a heat pump as is for natural gas, particularly now with natural gas prices going up. I don't think that's going to be hard to honestly persuade people. Yeah, I don't think it's gonna be hard to persuade people.
Paul?
So I guess my suggestion would be, this will need to take place in steps. So to me, the role of the task force, if you feel, when you feel that you're ready to take an action, would be to make a formal recommendation to the city council that this be a top policy priority for this coming fiscal year that incidentally starts in 3 weeks. The council, upon determining that, will task the city manager with whatever homework needs to be done to bring this from the idea and research that's been done to the proposal and resourcing necessary for it. And that may be in-house, that may be out-of-house. It may involve having an advisory group that talks through some of these sort of important but nuanced in the big scale issues. Whether it's 80 or 85 or 90% and what there's an exception for or not is a critically important piece, but it's not the question of, are we doing the big part of it? So that would be my suggestion as to steps. In terms of the action of the task force, what supplemental material would you want to give at this stage to recommend the council make this a top policy priority? I guess that's what I would suggest.
If I read the legal counsel recommendation by itself, if any resident reads it, they will look at that as saying, look, we got to establish the inspection program first. That's the basis for supporting this ordinance. That's the interpretation anybody would get if you just read that memo by
I
itself.
didn't read it that way, so I'm not, so maybe we should read it together.
It's actually
It says on the last paragraph. I mean,
it is our recommendation that the city first analyze the feasibility of implementing a more robust building inspection program that could enforce and ensure compliance with any adopted regulations prior to or commensurate with adopting specific building.
That's not a legal
requirements.
opinion, that's like a political recommendation.
It
Well,
is a political.
That's not a legal opinion.
The
No,
sentence,
it's
the
not.
sentence
Right,
before.
okay,
It's a city attorney.
right, that's what I'm saying. I didn't read that as qualifying their legal opinion.
Well, the sentence before says that it may prove to be insufficient to accomplish the purpose of the ordinance without the inspection.
That's also a political conclusion, not a legal conclusion.
Well, it's a practical
don't- yeah,
I
conclusion.
understand, but it's not a legal opinion.
Maybe we should ask Helen if the city council is more likely to listen to the city attorney or to the climate task force on this.
Mm.
Well, I think they will listen to the city attorney, but I will also tell you that there's been a fair amount of conversation by the council on the fact that we don't have inspection on single-family homes, and there's concern about that,
Mhm.
and that we should begin to think about that and fund that, because we have more and more rentals and there's no mechanism to make sure that the house is wired properly, has fire detector, they're supposed to, but there's no
Even in well, they are supposed to be doing that in multifamily.
they do in multiple, I'm talking about single-family homes.
Right.
Okay.
And so
Right,
there's
and
some
duplexes.
concern that we do stuff with new, not new single housing, new
Multifamily.
multi and in commercial, but not in single-family homes. So, and that's been the bulk of our development in the past number of years, I think. When you look at all the housing developments, yes, there's some of them have multiplexes, but the vast majority
I
are
think
single-family homes.
the majority of housing units have been multifamily, but the majority of you can get 40 in one building. That's one building, as opposed to 40 buildings that are single family homes. So it's more units, but fewer buildings.
Yeah. So does is city council's concern more of a life safety type of issue?
It was, that was the
And not
conversation.
necessarily the energy side of things?
We weren't discussing energy conservation at the time. It was really life safety. But I think there are certainly people on the council who are concerned about the energy goals. And to me, one of
They overlap quite a bit.
the pieces that would be helpful for the council is to, one, understand really what the city's goals are. And how this kind of action fits in to helping us meet those goals. So if it's a high priority and it has a big bang, then maybe that will take precedence over, or should, something else. So I
And-
think that's some of the information. I mean, obviously feasibility, the cost, impacts on affordable housing. All those things will get, chatted about.
Yeah, the other aspect of affordability that should be studied is also how much more are people paying for energy in homes today?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Bringing that up when we
Yeah.
think about our goals, I think some of the goals get maybe better understood or could possibly be better embraced when you then look at, and natural gas is going up, or propane to whatever, 3
Or
times what it
regardless of the heat.
costs.
The insulation is insulation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the proposals that the Energy Committee is looking into around the ARPA funding is the idea of funding a study, hopefully collaboratively with other towns or something that we'd work on with the state, of the potential for energy codes to reduce energy consumption relative to the status quo, right? The DOE has a building code program. They have a bunch of information about building codes. They've done studies like this in about 6 or 8 other states around the country. And so they've developed some estimates of how much improvement could there be, right? Their presentation that they put up showed that average energy use is at or better than code, but some of the items in a lot of the houses are worse than energy code. So enforcing code would still improve average energy for the total building stock. And they basically have a whole template, right? And so they say it's about $115,000 to do a state. And you go out and pull 200 random homes and gather a bunch of data and do some analysis and estimate what's the potential improvement. How many millions of dollars and tons of CO2 and all the other metrics would you save if you actually were able to get everyone at code? So there is a pathway we could follow to go and get one of the pieces of information. Obviously, there's a bunch of other pieces that we've identified in terms of what is the cost and what kind of support do we need to get it in place. But that's one thing we'd identified as the Energy Committee, that if we had that information, then we would be in a better place to assess. I mean, if it comes back and it says, well, we're not going to save very much because actually all the builders are already doing everything they possibly could and everything's great, well, then we'd say, well, okay, our job's done. Like, don't waste the time. We're very confident that that's not the case, right? But I think
How much would this study cost?
$115,000 is the DOE estimate
How
for the
mu-
whole state, for the whole
how
state.
much- How
Yeah.
much beyond? Because every 3 years, Efficiency Vermont has to do, the Public Service Board
Residential building stock.
requires them to do a study. So this doesn't sound like it goes like a step beyond what that study does. The difficulty that they've had in previous years with the Efficiency Vermont residential study is that they're basing all of their findings on the submitted certificates. And there's towns in Vermont that have never had a certificate submitted, even though there have been houses built there.
The DOE
So
template
the data is.
Can we get back to the
really-
ordinance?
well, I think
the
I think
data
what
is
We're
we're
talking
very
about the stretch
incomplete.
energy code, right?
No,
No,
we're
we're just
talking
talking
about
energy,
what
correct.
are the pieces of information that we want to recommend that the city pull together in order to make the decision, so that we have confidence that when they get all the information in front of them, that they'll be able to make a decision that's consistent with the goals that we're supporting, right?
Yeah, you need some proof of what we're saying, basically, because, people will just say, well, there's an energy code, why isn't that good enough?
I mean, I don't think there's a lot of debate that's happening here about
Yeah.
whether we should
No,
recommend.
no, I
that we-
just think
that we
we're
cut
getting a little
gas
off
out. It's
track in
How do we do it?
pulling up pieces of information and not really relevant to this particular ordinance, right? There's lots of information about how to build better, well-insulated, more efficient homes, and that's all great. But this is really narrow. This is about converting oil and propane to electric or maybe wood-fired, right? It's pretty narrow, and there's like lots of studies around that particular point. And I don't think we need to study ourselves. I think there's information out there that's easily gathered to establish what we need for this particular ordinance.
Here's the problem. If you convert a house to all electric heat pumps,
We're not talking about
And-
converting now, right?
no, but new construction, if you use all electric heat pumps and you have a construction that doesn't meet existing even RB standards, you are going to have a lot of problems in the wintertime because you won't be able to heat that house properly.
So all our buildings are supposed to meet the stretch code and they should be fine. So if a builder like chooses to do one thing correctly and another thing incorrectly, they're gonna have a very unhappy homeowner who's gonna sue 'em.
Well, that would cause a lot more lawsuits.
I mean,
If
right?
that's your objective, if that's your objective, that
So
would be
let
more
me ask
lawsuits.
this. Do we want as a task force to have the goal that we have, the recommend that this be done, that the city council do this, and that's it? We then hand this off to the implementation people. We're finished in September. Or do we want to be more aggressive and write our own memo to the city council and say, we think you should do this right now?
I would vote for the latter, and I don't think it would,
So
and I
just
don't
wanna
think it would be that
clear.
hard to pull together.
Okay, all right.
I mean, if I may just say, I do not understand the scope. I do not understand what is the resources involved here. I don't know how one would present to the city council and say this needs to be done urgently. I'm not seeing all that being pulled together.
We don't have the
There needs to
data.
be some body of work that needs to be done, other than saying this ordinance needs to happen.
Yeah.
Srini,
We're lacking
this is
data.
where it came from, right? The origin of this was the science-based targets,
I understand.
right? That said, we won't meet the goals the city has set out unless we stop building fossil fuel homes. We then realized Burlington's already passed that ordinance.
Yeah.
And so we put two and two together and said, we've got an ordinance that allows us to meet our science-based targets that a neighboring city has already passed and that people are already complying with.
Yeah.
And I think we can pull that together in a PowerPoint with studies that support that it's not going to damage our affordable housing goals. And I wouldn't think it'd be that controversial.
I
It's controversial
understand.
in Burlington, certainly.
Not the ordinance, it wasn't. They said the ordinance passed like butter. There was no controversy around it.
Well, because the ordinance was affecting new construction.
Exactly, but
only.
that's what this is
So
affecting.
People
even
don't
though-
get that involved.
The
in
the
new
charter
construction.
change
Not making me
was a lot of
change my
discussion.
heating.
Right.
They told us
system
on the
that
phone, the
way.
ordinance, there was no controversy. That's what they said on the phone.
Well, there was controversy, but it was in the commercial sector, because you can't just pass this for residential when a large percentage.
What
of
Jack
your
Hansen said on
fossil
the phone, the ordinance, there was no controversy around
But
the ordinance.
well, there was controversy when, the commercial engineers and building managers said, look, we can't do a building that's 100% electric.
Well, that's why they said
in this
85.
climate.
They're at 85.
That's why they put
So that's
85.
why they solved the controversy by saying 85%.
Okay,
Right.
so we could too.
We should
We
too.
should too.
We would do
yeah.
the same,
I mean.
But we should include commercial as well. It's not
Absolutely.
just
but
residential.
just like
I
Burlington
think
did.
that's the point. It's a
Yeah.
new
New
construction.
construction.
Yeah,
Right.
So to Darlene's point, this is an aspect of implementation. There's a recommendation, there is implementation. So we need to make a distinction between how we spend our time between now and September. This is where I asked the question, what else we have in the plan for the next 6 to 8 weeks? I think there's a lot of other elements need to come together. Even the science-based target work, I think it needs a lot of discussion. There's a lot of details that needs to be understood there. So I'm just raising the process question on where we spend our time. If this is an important aspect of implementation, yes, let's make it as a #1 priority. I don't know whether it's a priority between now and September.
So you
versus
might have
pulling-
missed the conversation, right? I mean, we're a climate task force. We're tasked with coming up with a plan.
Yeah.
But ultimately, all of us really are concerned about addressing climate change. That's why we're all
Sure.
here.
Sure.
And it's nuts to be sitting at this podium talking about a climate plan while builders are still hooking up homes with fossil fuel when our neighboring city has done something about it.
Exactly.
So.
And so
but no-
this
but no one
has to be a
is
priority.
arguing For not
No,
doing it.
No, Srini's talking about timing, and I'm addressing the timing question.
Look, I cannot change this world in 2 months. I would like to think that I'm doing some important work here that will have an impact for the next 15, 20, 30 years. I don't want that to be compromised. I'm just asking the question, how do we spend our time in the next 2 months? If you feel that this is the #1 priority in the next 2 months, that's fine. That's
I think we can walk and
perspective,
chew gum at the same
That's a
time. I'm happy to
perspective,
take a crack now with a legal opinion at putting together some memo or PowerPoint that we can look at the next time we meet and use as a foundation for presenting to the council.
I think that would be very helpful because then we could actually see.
Yeah, and we
what
can
it
see
involves.
something.
We could
Yeah.
talk about this forever.
Exactly.
You could also tee up a couple people from Burlington to have them be able to speak to how they did it in Burlington and how it's working and how they're enforcing it. And that's the kind of thing that the city council would want to hear.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great idea, great idea. Let them hear a different perspective on how it got done.
So let's get that on the agenda for
Yeah.
our next meeting, if you can be ready by then, Andrew.
I can do that.
Okay.
Any other discussion about the ordinance? Should we move on to talk about the charter?
Can I
change
just
yet?
ask a clarification question?
Sure.
So is the city attorney's opinion important or not?
It's critical.
So I just want to make sure. Did the city attorney made a recommendation that the inspection capability be a part of the ordinance? Is that an important opinion or not?
So I guess what I would say is the first question posed is, does the city have the authority to do this? That
Right,
was the
and they said
fundamental
yes.
question that you
Okay.
posed. The answer is yes.
Yes, okay,
As an implementation
yeah.
in doing their legal homework,
I see.
it is a recommendation that a best practice, if the city were to implement, would be to pursue it with a
Okay.
implementation, with a inspection in order to achieve success based on preliminary research. I
And
think that
doesn't hurt us for the attorney to say that in public. It's fine. It sets up our plan because we have inspections in our plan. So we say,
Absolutely.
right, that will be the next thing that will be done. But we can get this piece done if we want to. If we want to go for it, we could go for it.
I
I
think
mean-
realistically, likely before council votes on it, they will want to know, even if it's not on day one, what are you getting into?
Fine.
Financially over a period of time, because, saying we'll do inspections starting next year and then having a $400,000 cost to the city without revenue as a theoretical hypothetical would be a very challenging place for the council to be.
Paul, can I ask you a question on that? When the city adopted the residential energy stretch code, was there a similar discussion? And if so, how was it resolved?
No, because in that instance, we don't take any action. It is based entirely on the existing state structure, which is
But we did
You-
take action to adopt it and make it part of the city's.
right. But
ordinances.
the enforcement mechanism is the one laid out under the state statutes, which is that an individual homeowner who is aggrieved can go after their builder.
Right.
So we have no role in that.
But we
In
didn't have-
theory, this could happen as well, but then the question is, can we answer questions? This is not a statewide program, it's a South Burlington program in this instance, if we do it. So there isn't somebody to turn and say that there are people who can answer questions about the stretch code with Efficiency Vermont. There would not yet be, we would have to build the structure to answer questions. And then from an enforcement perspective, that's a policy question of, do you want it to be a self-enforcement? Do you want it to be something where the city has a role in it? And it's without making this too complex, it does lead to breadcrumbs like what Donna has spoken to, of saying, well, if we're going to be inspecting for the heating system, why are we not also inspecting to see if the electrical system was done correctly in that same building. It becomes a question that the council will need to answer. They may be perfectly satisfied to do one, but I suspect they're gonna get that question at some point from somebody. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're getting to is that in the interest of getting there quickly, having everything lined up and making sure that we don't rush in and then wind up getting set back to have to go and do more research and going in loops and it'd be.
well, and ultimately, the council will task the city manager with taking on some of these, the work of this. That's the council's job to decide on that policy. We won't, a volunteer group nor me won't write an actual ordinance. That will be a task that is asked of the council will ask of the city manager to do that.
So it sounds like, just to loop back to make sure that we have a clear task. Are we clear and agreed on what the component, in the memo that you're drafting, how we want to frame up the question about inspections? Something else that should be studied? Is there?
Look, let me take a crack at it. I mean, again, we've already recommended inspections, not just for this, but for lots of stuff.
Yeah.
I think inspections would great. It would certainly enhance compliance. But I think it's better to get some rather than nothing. And if you shoot for all, maybe you get nothing. So I think that's the way I would frame it.
Well, I think you want to be careful to, have the complete picture and address it, that there are steps involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me take a crack at a document and then we can all critique it.
Yeah, the other piece that I don't know if it's anything that is accessible or not, because I think the city can maybe get the information, maybe not. I know Efficiency Vermont has access to the information, but it has been questioned about new houses. Is there data on the amount of fossil fuels being consumed by new houses in South Burlington? Is that data available? And is there a comparison with houses that are, 10 years old or more?
But we have that data.
Do we have this data?
Don't we have the natural
Yeah,
gas
we
from
do.
Vermont Gas Systems through
Yeah, we
the
do.
Georgetown project?
Well, we recently updated.
Have
it.
done that in the past,
Well,
I believe.
the
yes.
update we have
Based
recently
on
is-
age,
is
based on
is
age.
aggregate. So we have all residential buildings.
Right.
Yeah,
And
no,
by
but
home, by building. but
based on age.
My building's in there.
The
Has to be
recent update
based
that we
on
have has
age.
one line for residential, one line for commercial.
The spreadsheet I saw 6 months ago had every single building in South Burlington with the natural gas use.
I think that went back to Georgetown. So from that era, we have individual granular level. I promise
think
you the
so.
recent one we got doesn't have granular.
Well, we did get it for Georgetown,
Yep.
and
So is
Vermont
it-
Gas Systems
Has it?
produced it, I
They
assume.
produced it.
They did.
Can they produce an updated one?
Yeah, we can ask them for it. It's
Especially if we're gonna turn the spigot off, they'll be more than happy.
well, in
This is
theory,
part of their goal. They're a B corporation.
they're on board.
True, this is true.
This is
They've
part of the
stated
goal.
that.
They should support this.
I think it's completely reasonable to ask them. I know when we talked to Tim Perrin about this last night. He pointed out that typically utilities don't release individual identified data sets without permission from each individual customer.
By street
Um,
perhaps? By street, because, houses on streets tend to be similar age.
Well, they did release it to us before, so it's possible they would again, or we could maybe work with them to get by age or some other way. So, Paul, did you have?
I just want to pull everybody a little bit out of the weeds here.
Yep.
Taking a big step back here. Later on the agenda, Melanie and Anne are going to talk about high impact actions. Sort of to Darylyn's point from earlier, you will be working with the full list of actions that you got and the science-based targets. And in the end, you're going to be recommending a full list and hopefully also what are the highest priority things that you'd like to see accomplished in the first year or 2 years. A decision point for you to make is, do you want to make this one that you just talked about in
Mhm.
advance of that or together as the number one?
Oh.
And it doesn't, it's either way, it's due in September. There's no right or wrong to that, but I did want to sort of take it back to this will be, whether it's a standalone, it'll be the first of hopefully a handful of really high policy priority recommendations to council, and then a whole list of things to work on over the next couple of years, but I think it'll be important for council to see what are you identifying as the biggest bang things to jump on in year 1 and 2.
Right.
So I just want to sort of bring this back that this is, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there are gonna be implementation groups to take on those things, right?
I
After we're finished.
I think that the structure of that is to be determined. We were waiting to see what
What we do.
what the results are. There are implementation funds on
Okay.
certain areas, but it hasn't, the structure hasn't been set up yet.
Okay, thank you.
Before we leave the ordinance, actually, last time we talked a little bit about hot water heat pumps, right? Burlington made a decision not to require hot water heat pumps in new construction because some big developer said for some really large projects, the technology is not quite there. I think we should put it in our ordinance, and we can put an exception if it's not reasonably feasible, or, you know, some
For
appropriate
huge
words.
Commercial buildings.
Yeah,
fine.
so that would be, I guess, my
Carve out for huge
exactly,
buildings.
but just to carve out some, you know, if it's not, some reasonable carve out.
We could carve out Beta.
You can carve out Beta if Beta wants to be carved out.
You better carve out Beta.
Yeah. I don't- Not sure if they're the challenge, but
Happen,
yeah.
right?
I suspect Beta is doing a pretty good job in their
Yes,
building.
I'm sure they want to
So-
do that.
All gonna drive electric cars.
So also to Paul's point, we should make sure that we don't shortchange ourselves in terms of some of the items further down the agenda.
Yeah.
The other piece of this was the charter change. Do we want to just decide to do the same thing and task someone with drafting a memo about the charter change? Do we need to have a discussion about whether we think the charter change should go a similar way? And again, we're almost at 8 o'clock here, and we still have the science-based targets, prioritization of sectors and actions, and public outreach, which
Yeah.
and equity.
Well, the
Can I
charter,
make, can I make a suggestion on the charter change? Can we get someone from the charter change committee to come and talk to us for 15 minutes at the next meeting?
You know, I don't think you need to get that granular. I think if the recommendation is that you want an ordinance that does X, Y, and Z, and that it's clear that that ordinance requires a charter change,
They're,
city government knows how to figure out how you get.
but they're
Right,
two
no,
separate.
but there would
they're two
also be
separate-
an ordinance ultimately
No,
for
no,
the
no,
charter
well,
change
right, yes.
afterwards.
Wait, they're two separate things. The ordinance will address new buildings, right? And the
No,
charter
the charter
change.
change
But a
will
charter
ultimately
change
result in an ordinance.
Enables
That's
an
right.
ordinance later.
Yeah.
So I think it is
Exactly.
consistent.
A
Second ordinance, a second ordinance.
Yeah.
The charter is just an enabling authority
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for a second ordinance, right?
for
We,
second ordinance, right?
Yes,
the two things
yes.
could happen separately.
Correct.
And the city knows how to do that. I don't
Not for
think
the first one.
this
Okay, all right.
committee needs to get
fine.
into the
Okay,
weeds of how you
Okay.
get a charter change written and
Right.
okay.
passed.
But Helen, does the council similarly need like a presentation to kick off the discussion about the charter change? Or are you kind of happy just like, how does that process get initiated?
Well, well, we have a charter committee, so we would have to task them with coming up with the charter change.
I think that's what, that comes back to Sweeney's.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I
But
think,
that's a city committee. It's not this committee.
Right,
It's
so
a-
you would say, send it over to the charter committee and say, hey, take a look at this, we'd like to do it? I mean, is that,
the Council would, I think, decide, yeah, we want this change to our charter.
right, but how,
You-
I guess, how's it get on the council's agenda?
similar to the other, you would.
Yeah,
you
you're
would
gonna be,
propose-
this task force is gonna be making recommendations.
Okay,
Some
To
of
the
which
council.
will.
okay, so I mean,
require-
honestly, I can wrap both things into the
Now, I
PowerPoint
will
or
say,
put
just
together.
backing up for a second, there will be a big difference between a charter change and an ordinance, which is the voters will need to approve
Oh,
a
yeah.
charter change. So
Right,
functionally, it's, you know, the logistics of it is council and city administration, but think about how are you going to get the majority of voters to want to say yes to this?
Yeah,
right.
That's the
Yeah.
bigger,
Oh, yeah.
Donna was
Oh,
on the
yeah,
Bike Ped
and
Committee
that's
for the Penny for
public
Paths.
outreach.
That's a big, long effort
Yeah.
to make sure
Yeah.
that you have created the conditions where the voters want to say yes to this.
There's another issue too, right? So all that is true and complicated. At the end of the ordinance for new buildings, there's a really clear outcome, which is we change the code. New buildings are required to meet the code. We can debate about how that's enforced. At the end of charter change to allow the city to create regulations around existing buildings is no one has any idea.
Yeah, another debate. Yeah.
There's no implementation process. Burlington hasn't even figured out an implementation process, right? They
But
have
we'll
decided that
be
they're not
about
going
a
to
year
start
and a half
banging on
behind them, so
doors.
we'll be able to copy them.
I think the
Well,
on-
but they have a municipal
But
utility
we
with an
want to start with
efficiency
new building
program.
anyway, so.
Yeah.
And right now, they're not even contemplating doing more than commercial and public
Right.
buildings.
Right.
Right.
They're starting with the high users, you
Yeah.
know, and like I said, you know.
Well, and where they
The
have
highest users are the
control,
commercial and the multifamily
Or
buildings.
some control on public buildings. I mean, that's.
Which
I
which
guess
makes
my point
sense.
is that I think if there's a discussion to be had in this group, it's just as important for us to figure out what do we think that we're asking the city to be shooting toward versus just saying, well, let's ask for the authority without any kind of sense of what they would
Well,
use
I
the
think
authority
it's really
for.
clear. We want to have, potentially have the changes mandated for new construction, both private and commercial.
But
Right,
that
and
doesn't
the
require a
charter change will allow the city over the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years to eventually transition the existing building stock.
Right.
And how exactly that's going to be done, I don't know, we can predict.
Right, the new buildings don't require a charter change. The charter change is to get us into that unknown territory of doing something about existing buildings. So that's what I'm just saying. I think that might be,
What was Burlington's charter change? I thought they had to have a charter change in order to
No,
impose.
no. So they were able to, for new buildings, just pass this ordinance, simple,
Oh,
council
okay.
vote. The charter change was allow them to have the authority for existing buildings.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
And
So
so
that's step two.
that's
and
step 2. That's going to take longer, vote, blah, blah, blah.
And I think you make that clear to the council. We're just talking about new buildings.
And the scope is much smaller.
The
Yeah,
scope is,
Yeah.
much smaller. yeah,
well, in our community, it's a lot, but I mean,
Yeah.
we're building a lot of buildings.
Look,
Yeah.
existing buildings will require regs and education
Yeah.
and inducements and
Yeah.
lots of stuff, right? And maybe
Yep.
technologies that haven't been developed yet, and
Right.
the federal government is now incenting heat pumps through the Defense Reduction Act. I mean, there's going to be lots of things, right? We have to keep on top of that and enact smart policy once we have the authority to do so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
we
I
have a
think
plan.
that's pretty clear.
okay, so it sounds like it's a good idea to keep them separate and clarify that in the memo though, since there's.
Oh, yeah, the
obviously some
two, yeah,
confusion.
no, right, it would be, exactly, it would be,
Yeah.
we have to make sure people don't confuse the two things because they're easily confused.
And you have access to my document with all the notes from our calls. if that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so if we've covered what we need for next steps there, let's move on to the science-based targets.
So
Can you turn your mic on if it's not on?
it is on.
Okay, can you bring it closer then?
Yep. Okay, so I don't know what page in your packet.
Can this be up on the screen?
Yep. Do you want to share your screen or do you want me to do it from here?
I don't know how to share my
Or
screen.
just join the meeting? As though you were somewhere else, but I can just do it if that's.
Yeah, if
easier.
you can do it, that would
Okay,
be
just tell
easiest.
me what you'd like me to.
So go to the second page of the CCRPC memo in the packet. Yeah,
Right.
so
Next page.
yeah, the next page.
One that has a chart.
Yeah, so I'm gonna walk you through
are
the
you
science-based target analysis, so everybody could understand the inputs and the outputs.
Okay.
So just so you guys know, the science-based target analysis that we got from ICLEI back in February is one scenario. They used a different tool that I don't have access to. They did a spreadsheet exercise. Have access to ICLEI's tool called ClearPath. It's a modeling tool. That's what we said that we would be using in the scope. So, and also the scenarios that we have here are an iterative process. When I presented the science-based targets, I guess a month or two ago, the data was different. I've been iterating through this to identify a scenario that is customized for South Burlington. So I just want to ground you in that. I know Andrew talked about like the 11% of residential square footage. The modeling that I did this time around is a little bit different. The inputs are a little bit different. So I just wanted to clarify that. So I will take you through the progression of the data, and I think it's just best to do it this way. instead of like a PowerPoint presentation. So just bear with me. So the first rows where it says science-based targets and emission goal, we have the 2030 emission reduction goal. That's the science-based target that ICLEI gave us in February that estimates South Burlington's fair share of meeting the Paris Accord, and it's also in alignment with the Global Warming Solutions Act here in Vermont. The next column over, the base year.
What's the, just the column that says 2030 BAU, the 196,071, what does that represent?
Business.
So
as
let me get there.
usual.
So let me go
Oh,
through
okay.
everything and then then you can ask me questions.
Melanie, can you just slow down a hair? So 60% means what?
So 60% is the amount of emissions. So South Burlington needs to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 60% to meet the
From 2019 numbers to 2030.
correct.
Okay.
From
In
20
order to meet the
Wow.
goals, which are
Yeah, right.
90% reduction by
That's where it hits home.
2050, et cetera, et cetera. And why is it
Be
60% in the first
1995.
10 years in order to get to 90% over? Is it just because the last part is harder to get, or because we're actually higher than the Paris
Well,
Accord?
it's 60%. ICLEI's methodology was based on gross domestic product and their contribution to the global economy. So 60% was what ICLEI established for South Burlington. So that's the starting point. The actions and measures that were modeled are based on a starting point of 2023. And so South Burlington needs to reduce their emissions by 60% over time to meet the Paris Accord
So
and the Global Warming Solutions Act. They're not going to align exactly with what's in statute, like in terms of 90% renewable by 2050, because we're looking at kind of total energy and all the sectors that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions.
So Melanie, if I understood right, the original Paris Accord had a baseline of 1995 target. 1995 target was a 60% reduction by 2030, and then there were subsequent targets for 2050. So we don't have a 1995 basis. The closest basis we have is 2019, right?
I do have data, and I presented it in the last presentation
Yeah.
that shows the data does align with that baseline reduction from 1990 and I think 2005.
I see.
And that was still the 60%. So we're still
I don't want to
shooting
get
for
hung
the
up on the first
60%
box, so I
reduction.
apologize. I just want to make sure that when we get to a report, that it's clear that 60% isn't us overshooting, it's being on track for, and it comes across without understanding all of it, that it's, well, if we're super aggressive in the next 5 years, we can sit on our laurels for the next 20 years after that and just coast to the finish line. And I don't think that's what this is saying, but it comes across a little bit like that, just seeing a number. So maybe we can help to, because a lot of this is about public messaging ultimately. So why is this why do we have to hit this number? And I don't want to get into it more now. I just think that's an important fundamental to some really aggressive things that are coming up afterwards as to why we need to be that aggressive.
Okay. I mean, we have to be aggressive because we're starting in 2023 and the 60% reduction is what gets us to meeting the Paris Accord and the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so if you go over to the last column where it says 2030 science-based targets and Global Warming Solution Act, that is what South Burlington's emission profile needs to look like in 2030.
Okay.
Okay, so that's 77,822 metric tons of CO2. And then when we go below and do the modeling of the measures that are represented in the draft climate action plan, where we end up is about 76,465 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So it's not exactly 77,000, it's a little bit less, but modeling the actions that are modelable get us to that 60% reduction. Okay, So going back to the base year, so when we last talked about base year, we decided that 2019 would be the best base year to use. It's pre-COVID, so we are capturing some of the dynamics that happened with telecommuting. And so, we're starting from 2019. So the base year 2019, South Burlington emitted 195,532 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And then the next column over is business as usual in 2030. If no changes are made, the emission profile pretty much stays the same. There are some business as usual policy changes that are modeled. And so that's Green Mountain Power's emission factor essentially being carbon free starting in 2020, and then also CAFE standards.
That takes account all the new buildings, assuming they will be fossil fuel based, that BAU scenario.
It does.
But it also probably factors in that appliance standards are going to go down as well as cafe.
Right.
Okay, well, that's a piece of good news.
So,
That's I mean, it doesn't mean we can rest on our laurels, but that's a good news to say that outside standards are bringing the numbers down given population growth. So that's good.
and it does assume some growth in the city. Employment 1% annually, population 1.3% annually. I talked about the grid admissions, and then vehicle miles travel increasing similarly to population. So that's the growth that's contemplated in both the business as usual case and the science-based target case.
Melanie, is your population growth figure just standard what regional planning is using for all of Chittenden County, or is that specific to? How did you
So
come up with that figure?
So I came up with that. I started with the ECOS population projection. But in some of the towns, and I think South Burlington is one of them, has already achieved its 2030 ECOS plan population projection. So I did not rely on that. I looked at the population change between 2010 and 2020. So that's how I
Okay,
got to the 1.3%.
okay.
Yeah, it's pretty on track with exactly where we've been. The last 10 years, we've done 1.28% population growth and 1.4% housing growth. So, and the last 10 years encompasses a slow time, a busy time. It's pretty standard to the last 40 years in South Burlington. So it's about as good as we're gonna have.
So Melanie, I think you said there are offsetting factors that keep the business as usual as a similar number. So if you just look at building alone, let's not look at cafes contribution and the energy contribution from the grid. If you just look at building alone, how does the model account for building growth between 2023 to 2030?
I guess as we scroll down.
Yeah, so I mean, so I have everything separated out by sector.
I understand that, but I'm just looking for, how do you account for number of new buildings as a unit growth from 2023 to 2030?
It's analogous to the population change. So
So what's the number?
it's one, I don't know
Okay,
off the top of my head, the number of new buildings.
yeah.
I'm from a residential perspective, I think it's like a little bit over 9,000, maybe close to 10,000.
over the
But,
time period.
the assumptions of households are baked into that population growth.
Okay, I just want to understand how this is possibly a question you're going to get from other people, because everybody has got this number that every year 1,000 units are being built in South Burlington. How they're going to be accounted for.
What is that?
150, not 1,000,
Sorry,
just to be
150,
clear.
1,000 units are being permitted, 150 units are being. permitted.
There are 1,000 that have been. It's not what's happening every year,
Sorry, I
just to be
misspoke. Sorry, I
clear.
misspoke. 1,000 units in the pipeline, 150 on an average being built. If you look at the incremental contribution of that, that's a sizable number. So you're going to get the question. So
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I could look more into the details of the model, but it's assumption based, and it's that population
Okay.
change that drives the residential sector for energy consumption use over
It's
time.
baked into the
buildings.
second, into the third column here.
We could stress test this a little bit, right? It's 150 homes a year. This is about 5,000 metric tons over a decade. 500 metric tons a year. So we're saying each home is 4 or 5 metric tons. Does that sound about right? I mean, you can just stress test it, right?
Yeah, about that. It's more like 7 or 8. Yeah.
Okay, but so it's kind of like order of magnitude in the right ballpark, the 5,000 metric tons for that number of homes.
It'll be 1,500 per year for 8 years. So it'll be roughly about 10,000 tons. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can look more into it. That's not something that I have readily available, and that's not the format that I
okay,
put the
okay.
data in.
Okay.
So just going down to the bottom, we have 3 different scenarios
Well,
with,
sorry, before we get there, so the science-based target, is that just a raw, 60% reduction of each number? Or were different sectors treated differently?
Well, they're clearly treated differently because we
I
have some
can see that.
sectors that aren't represented here.
No, I'm just curious how the different sectors were. How the
So
targets were determined for each sector.
so the targets are based on the modeled measures
Makes no sense.
that are on the next page.
Kind of backed into, okay, what are the measures that we can do? What does that produce and iterate around it to achieve the goal?
Yeah, so if you look on the next page, they're the list of measures that were modeled off of the draft plan actions. And so from modeling those measures, the reductions that were achieved in the science-based target scenario are in that science-based target scenario column. So that's how we get to that 60% reduction. Does that answer your question?
And I think an important thing, Melanie, you and I had a couple of conversations. These are cards that could be moved around in theory. You could say, what if we did more homes, but people drove more also? What if we drove even less, but we got fewer homes? This is where you sort of settled on a sort of across the board best shot at achievability. We could model 100 different versions of this,
Exactly.
but this is sort of I would advocate that in the report that we talk about this as a little bit of a range. You could do more homes or fewer homes, but all these in
Right.
terms of what each sector accomplishes, it's sort of a this to this, depending on where we focus our attention in the coming 6 or 7 or 8, 10 years.
Are you going to go back to the first page? Because there was something on there that I really don't understand.
The first page of the graph.
Right, yeah.
Of the table.
The industrial natural gas and industrial electric. It's not clear to me why under business as usual, the electric use goes to 0.
So that's because of Green Mountain Power's portfolio, because they're essentially carbon free as of 2020. So that
Oh.
that is why the industrial electric usage goes to 0.
Okay,
That's why residential electric goes to 0 in the business as usual
okay.
case, and that's why commercial electric goes to
Okay.
0, because that is a policy that's already currently in place.
Okay, and then under natural gas, I guess it's a question in industrial uses. Most of the energy use is not for heating, not for space heating. It's for industrial process heating. And what I've been reading is that those are very, very difficult to electrify. That, because it's the intensity. Some of them may, but it's kind of industry dependent. So how general is this? And because if it's really general, how accurate could it possibly be without knowing the industries? I mean, are we talking about the airport? Jet fuel?
Yeah,
It's like,
so
there's no
Industrial-
real,
Can I just, sorry, the industrial fuel reduction is 1% of our total reductions overall in the process. So I don't know if we should drill down too deeply. It's about 1,500 tons out of 150,000 tons that we're going to reduce. So whether it's 1.5% or 0.5% probably isn't gonna tip things tonight.
Well,
Just,
Yeah,
just in
just
interest
the
of time,
number,
like,
I
I
understand.
totally agree with you.
I understand.
totally agree
The
with your
numbers
concern.
just seem wacky.
Yeah,
Just point that out and just
it's a hard,
understand where
it's
they
a
come
hard
from.
question, totally.
Yeah.
The definition for industrial versus commercial, like how numbers of employees or square feet? or-
So it's based off of the industrial natural gas consumption that was provided from the work that the Energy Committee did for 2019. So I built the 2019 inventory off of that data. And so there was, sort of a sector split. There was commercial natural gas consumption and there was industrial natural gas.
VGS rate code, I think,
Yeah.
is what drove it. And I don't
Yeah.
know I can check what their rules are for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Probably related to those numbers.
Heavy industry down.
No, we don't.
Talking about like, like steel is
Or cars or something, yeah, we don't do that.
There's stuff hiding around.
Yeah,
If
there
you're
is-
really
there is
interested, you just
stuff,
don't drive
yeah.
by it. When I was at Efficiency Vermont,
Yeah.
I was amazed at how many industrial parks are hiding back in there.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly find out more about the industrial natural gas. Is that space heating or is that process
Right.
energy? I don't know.
Again, I think it's a small piece.
Yeah.
Is a rounding error.
That's more than a 1% reduction shown
Okay.
there.
1% out of our total
keep going.
150.
Okay, so going back to the first page, just looking at the base year business as usual, the science-based target 2030 modeled emissions, everything is broken down by fuel and sector. And so you can see what the emission reductions are between the business as usual case and the 2030 modeled emissions. So I don't think I need to go over every sector.
Yeah.
We've already answered specific
So-
questions,
So
but
Melanie, can I ask a specific question around commercial natural gas and commercial electric?
sure.
How is the government operation? Where is the government operation captured here?
So that is embedded in this inventory and scenario. So government operations is in probably in the commercial sector. Yeah, government operations is in the commercial.
Including the school district is in the commercial.
Yes, all
sector?
the buildings that are non-residential are in the commercial sector.
Okay,
Me and Ann are working with Lou to
okay.
develop a government operations inventory and then
Right. Essentially, it's the same thing from an energy perspective. It's a commercial building. It's just we happen
Yeah.
to have operational control over them.
There's a small possibility that there's a couple of small buildings that have gotten onto residential rates
I see.
that the city pays for.
Okay,
But I think, again, it's a safe assumption that it's a pretty small portion of the city's total impact. So, I mean, we have the data, we could drill down into it, but I don't know that it's a good
Okay.
use of time.
okay.
Generally, commercial, I think, is a
Yeah.
safe answer.
okay, so I think one thing to point out between base year and business as usual, you'll see the transportation emissions goes down. That's because of cafe standards. And then going down to the total, you can see that emissions stay pretty steady between now and 2030. And then we get to the 2030 science-based target scenario down to 76,465 metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And that's because of the modeled measures on the next page. And then also provided some information on carbon sequestration, what the carbon sequestration and storage rate has been annually from land cover change from forest to settlement between 2001 and 2019. So that's that 1,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So that is an addition. And then the next column down is the removals. Sorry, I misspoke. The 1,000 is emissions, and then the one underneath it is carbon sequestration and storage. So you can see that the forested and treed areas, there's a land cover map on the next page that is saying that annually, South Burlington is seeing about 8,700 metric tons of CO2 equivalent in carbon storage in forested land cover.
So,
And so that's been netted out. So from an inventory accounting perspective, that gets South Burlington down to about 68,000 metric tons. So that's a little bit more aggressive than the 60% reduction and what Paul said, we can iterate this model and try and, understand what the ranges are, but the scenario presented here is kind of a balanced scenario and seems to model the actions that are in the climate action plan as best as we can.
can I comment on a couple of things here? So in a typical greenhouse gas emissions inventory, there is usually thermal, there is transportation, there is industrial, there is agricultural, there is electricity, there is wastewater and waste, right? So that's what you typically see in a greenhouse. And every city or every organization focuses on each of those to see what they can do to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to a specific target on a 2030 or a 2050, right? So it's kind of unusual that you have captured the land and forest, sequestering as part of the inventory here. So that's just one comment.
Well, it's actually, it's reported after the total and it's a net. And so, I'm going with best practice and how it's done typically with inventories and also looking at carbon storage and sequestration.
Okay, I'm just stating that the other climate action plans I have seen, greenhouse gas emissions inventory does not include land contributions. It includes agricultural and other farming type contributions. For whatever reason, we have included these two items here, and I'm not sure why. So I'm just thinking about communicating to the public. If you have specific land preservation actions that leads to further sequestration from where we are today, it's okay to include them as a potential greenhouse gas emissions pathway reduction. But to include that as part of this inventory, it seems unusual.
But doesn't
The
this
state has done it that way,
speak to
though.
the importance of conserving the forests that we do
Well,
I
have?
understand.
I mean,
I'm just-
it's a great speaking point, right? Look, the forests are almost,
Supports
10,000 metric tons a year, and make sure we don't cut them down.
I understand that.
But
Just
this,
finding out.
Srini, but the
and-
state does do it that way. The state climate action report does include it. So I
Well-
think it's being consistent with the state's reporting.
But I think, straight to your point, I mean, I think there's a total line before we get to trees.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the one that is closer to the target we have.
Yeah.
So when I read this, I see that the non-tree portions
Yeah.
are meeting that goal. And then there's just some acknowledgement that here's the steady state. So
I'm
it's
just
a
trying
good
to,
messaging
I'm just
point.
trying to articulate what is typically communicated. A greenhouse gas emissions inventory is communicated in a pie chart. When you see a pie chart, you do not see land contributions. You see the actual contributors of greenhouse gas emitters that are created by man. Most of all these buckets, as I just said, are created by man. So land and forest exist naturally, and they sequester. I understand what climate action plan does for Vermont. They do show that inventory on a table. I'm just trying to illustrate that when you articulate what is South Burlington's greenhouse gas emissions is, I think you have to stop at the top line.
Well, you also made the point
I mean,
about
I've-
agriculture not being on there,
Yeah,
but South Burlington has so little agricultural
understand,
content
I
and very
understand.
few cows
I understand.
specifically.
I
So
understand.
it kind of doesn't have much of an impact here.
So,
Look at-
so two things. This is your plan. If you don't want it in here, we can take it out. Second thing is
Okay.
habitat blocks, conservation of habitat blocks
Sure.
in South Burlington does play a role in carbon storage and carbon sequestration. And that is it's a policy trajectory, and it does,
I-
it's not in the inventory. I reported it outside, and it does play a role in
Okay.
carbon sequestration, and it is a priority of the state climate action plan that
Exactly.
they want to slow
Okay.
fragmentation of forests because of the carbon sequestration.
And we could think about it another way,
properties.
which is that if you looked at it and said, our plan is to I'm not saying it is, but if our assumption was that we were going to lose half our forest in the next 10 years, then we would have to account for 4,000 more.
Right.
By by advancing the policy of not having more forest removed, we're not going deeper in the hole.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what this is saying in here,
Right. And
is that an action to retain habitat blocks is it's the opposite. If we didn't have that policy, we'd have to be accounting for a loss of sequestration that we currently
Right.
have.
And I think it's also very important to have this in local reporting. One thing that I get on a monthly basis is your contribution in terms of fossil fuel savings when you have a solar system. They report it to you and then they say, this is the equivalent of 15 mature trees. And I always find that kind of interesting. It's like, oh, okay, so you have a choice. You can put 15 trees in your yard, or you can put up, a 2.5, or no, I don't know what sizes, but you can put up like 20 solar panels.
Yeah.
Something like that. There are options there, either one works,
Or both.
or both,
Yeah.
as long as you have a big enough yard.
Okay, so going on to the measures. So as I mentioned before, these are the measures that can be modeled in ClearPath. They represent buildings and thermal and transportation. So our start year is 2023, end year is 2030. From retrofitting 500 homes every year to 2030, that gets us about 16,000 metric tons reduction. That's about 14% of the overall reduction. In addition to that, home weatherization is really important. So that 16,000 metric tons also includes home weatherization, and then commercial benchmarking and electrification. So that could be thought of as the 2030 district. So just trying to make some connections between the modeled measures and then what is actually written in the climate action plan language, which you could see on the next page. We presented the high impact actions as a way to see what we're modeling in ClearPath. And then, so that would be about 8% of commercial square footage electrified. And that gets us about 19,000 metric tons, about 16% reduction, 16% of the overall reduction. Industrial space heating, that is modeled from a energy use perspective. So reducing energy use in that industrial sector that was in the inventory by 10% annually. And then the next
Before we go
measure.
on to the next sections, can I ask a quick question,
Sure.
Melanie? So we talked about how in the last one, the base for 2030 includes the new development.
Yep.
So when we see these lists of residential electrification, number of new homes, does that include the new ones? So when we
Yeah,
say
so there's
500 a year,
Right. So
if 100 of those are new units that are fully electric, does that get to count towards that 500?
So the way it's described in ClearPath is it says retrofitted. So these are 500 homes retrofitted for electrification every year. And then it's assumed that anything new that comes online is electric and net zero.
But you said in the last one, it doesn't assume that. Up here, when we look at residential natural gas, business as usual accounts for population growth and we have more natural gas usage, right?
That business as, yeah, so that's the business as
But to hit the
usual.
target, because to hit the target, it assumes all new, you'll save that 5, because all new stuff is gonna be electric, and then to get from the 30 to the 18, you need to do the retrofit, right? That,
So the 18,645 is the total opportunity for natural gas from the previous page. 18,641 is the
Right.
total opportunity for residential.
So I guess I'm asking, I understand it's an assumption in there, but should we be saying as a measure, somehow accounting for the new buildings being net zero.
Well, that's what the footnote says.
Yeah, so they're assumed to be net zero.
So I think.
So
what I'm
any
hearing-
of the
what I'm
new
hearing is-
buildings that come online between 2023 and 2030 are net zero. So
Right,
they're not using.
But what happens if they're not? I guess I'm going back to the first part of this conversation of
And
building
you're
the
not gonna meet the
case.
target. You're gonna have to add those.
Right,
Right, so.
but I'm saying if this is gonna be a presentation, part of it needs to be, we can't just assume it, it has to be part of the case.
Yeah.
If you're gonna ask the council to do this ordinance in a few months, it should be accounted for that if we don't do it,
Yeah.
we're in the hole further, like
Well,
somewhere.
if we don't do
if
it,
we
that's
just say
the
it's
business
assumed-
as usual scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Right.
if the business as usual scenario includes non-electrified homes and the measure includes only retrofits, seems like there's a hole.
No,
in
no,
the
no,
model
because
somewhere.
this is not a target from the BAU. This is a target for 2019. This is not baselined off of BAU. This is baseline off of 2019. There's no hole.
Yeah, it assumes.
It starts with
what-
2019 and says everything new is gonna be carbon free and we're gonna retrofit, existing.
I think it assumes everything from 2023 for 8 years. So if I understand the first item,
Which
Five-
item?
the
Which first one?
residential electrification and number of housing units, you're going to do 500 housing units every year for the next 8 years. That's 4,000 total housing units out of existing 9,000 housing units, right? About 9,000.
Right,
So 50%, about 50% of the, more than 50% of the housing units, we said 150 for every year. If you assume the same rate, 150 times 8 is roughly 1,000. So the 4,000 units includes the 1,000 units that are going to be newly built. That's what specifically I think Paul is trying to ask the question. That's the 4,000 total units between 2023 and
Yep.
2030. Does that include new units being built at the rate of 150 units per year?
And the way the model presents it is that it's the number of housing units retrofitted. So it's 500 homes, existing homes being electrified.
So I don't
right.
think.
So I think after hearing this, it's a little bit of the same conversation we just had about the habitat blocks. If we don't do the net zero new buildings, we will be an additional, it's not a reduction, will be an additional X thousand in the hole.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, you'll be closer to the business as usual case.
That's why we need the ordinance.
Right.
Right, but
But we
what
need to
I'm
tell
saying
that
is,
story
it
and
needs to
Yes.
be,
a line item.
like, how do we,
Yeah.
how do we show that? Because right now, I would imagine showing this to a policymaker and saying, oh, and this assumes that we've done this other thing. Comparatively, how much does this other thing do?
And I
Well,
think it is worth-
if I were
maybe the
counsel,
way
I
to
might
do it is
say,
to clarify
maybe
the
we-
footnote, right? The footnote should say, the target, the modeling assumes all new buildings will be net zero. If new buildings are not net zero,
Then-
this would result in additional emissions of whatever,
5,000.
5,000, which we'd have to,
Yeah,
figure out how to reduce somewhere else,
so you
right?
compromise.
That's what the
this-
footnote can say.
You compromise the 1665 by 5,000 units
Right.
by not.
Yep. So
by-
I'm just trying to
yeah,
build the
yeah.
case of,
Yeah.
Yeah,
if I were the
exactly.
council, I would say, boy, there's a lot of big things to do.
Yeah.
I hear that the task force says that new buildings is the first thing to do, but prove it to me that that is the best first thing to do. So if we say that puts us 5,000 in the hole, and this is a relatively comparatively easy thing to do, that's building the argument. That's what I'm trying to get to here.
I see, yes.
Yeah,
And I think
exactly.
we should,
We should make
Change
that
their
clear.
Lifestyle.
Yeah,
It's just the new
Yeah.
house they buy
Yeah.
has been changed for them,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
which is a lot easier than.
So thank you, Melanie. Now I understand that why it's not shown as a reduction, because
Yeah,
it's one of those, if we don't do it, the number goes up.
but we might want to double check the BAU number just because it does go up by 5,000. Even though it says the assumption is that all new homes are net zero.
No,
So-
no, the BAU doesn't assume all new homes are net
Right,
zero.
that's the
BAU
difference.
assumes
You do nothing,
BAU.
it's nothing, right?
The
You don't do
BAU assumes
anything.
BAU, that
Yeah.
homes are using fossil fuels.
Modeling assumes that the BAU does not.
Exactly.
Business now.
Yeah.
Okay, I will look into this. These questions are helpful. I mean, it's, me doing the modeling, so it
No, I
helps
think
to
we-
like validate.
No,
it
we
a
all
little bit
understand the
more.
amount. I think it's
Good,
just,
Good.
I think it's just the explanation in the note, really. I think
Yeah.
that the note maybe just can be tweaked a little bit to say, the modeling assumes all new buildings are net zero. If they weren't, there'd be an additional, blank megatons of emissions, which would have to be reduced somewhere else.
Well, do they
Right.
really need to be net zero or just carbon free? I think they just need to be electrified.
Yeah. you- because
To-
you're talking
Right,
about-
in order
What
to
do you
meet
wanna
the
say?
carbon goal, if it's all
meet the
electric, it
goal.
doesn't
Yeah.
matter how
I mean,
much electric.
debatably,
Yeah.
that is net zero.
Yeah.
Offsite
Right.
solar is often considered, or renewables.
Fair.
Yeah, to
Fair
me, they're
enough, yeah.
equivalent.
Broader.
Yeah,
So,
just,
the
there's
only-
The public reading this isn't as smart as you,
Hmm,
and they really need it laid out, nor is the council. I
Yeah,
mean,
Well,
you
so,
really have to make it clear
yeah,
Yeah.
I,
what the,
this is just one
consequences
piece
of
of the
non-action
draft,
are.
so everybody can understand
yeah.
what the scenarios
There
are
does
and what
have to be a
are.
little bit of a five-alarm fire feeling when you look at this stuff.
Yeah.
If we're gonna
So,
get people to.
It gives me that.
It gives me that. Well, the first time we saw this a month or two ago is why I said, boy, we need to do this ordinance right now.
Yeah.
so one other question on the first line, are the 500 housing units that needs to be electrified and the 600 homes that need to be home weatherized, are they mutually exclusive or is it a combined target?
Right. we can ask that too.
Yeah, so they are combined
They're combined.
in the outputs of the model. So that's why the emission reduction is shown together for those two actions. I am unable to tell what emission reduction will get from just home weatherization.
So,
Could it be the
I mean,
same house
if
for
we're assuming
500 of
that-
those? Could it be the same building?
It could be, I mean, when I iterate through the model, we need both of those measures to get to the reduction.
So it could be 1,100 units, or it could be 600 units, of which 500 have both things happen, and that's fine. I'm just,
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know how it's gonna be implemented.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, because once you've electrified the home, weatherization counts for zero. So from that perspective, weatherization has no value for carbon reduction.
Right.
Once you're electrified because of our mix, practically
Uh,
speaking.
I
No,
disagree.
no. In the real world,
In
that's
the
not a
real
good
world,
strategy. I'm just saying from a
well-
modeling
Right.
perspective.
true, but you also can't assume that with existing homes, doing,
I
just
agree.
let me finish. That putting in heat pumps in most existing homes is not going to give you a 100% reduction of heating fossil fuels. Because in most cases, the heat pumps are going to be an addition to and substitute a high proportion of the heating fossil fuel use, but it will not cover everything because that's just not the way people are doing it. And even those houses that have put in, there's a combination heat pump, gas-fired unit that's quite popular with in basically, that's as good as you can do. But when the temperature goes below a certain temperature, it is still using fossil fuel. So just make sure that you're not assuming 100% fossil fuel reduction in those existing homes, because it won't be accurate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get what you're saying in practicality and how these systems are done for homes in real life. Again, it's a model.
In Vermont.
And I'll take another look at the model, and to see if there's some way that we can model the fact that people, need to use backup heat. If they're fully electric, but it may just be a model limitation, and the data just gives us a sense of the order of magnitude that needs to happen to get to these emission reductions. And so, I mean, yes, we're looking at data here, but it's not the be all end all.
Look,
And
hopefully if,
it
Yes,
kind of just
hopefully
gives
if
us
you've
a sense.
weatherized appropriately, like I know Keith Epstein has weatherized his home. He has heat pumps and he also has backup fossil fuels. So I've talked about this, but he told me his natural gas bill annually is like $20. He hardly ever uses
He's
it.
a perfectionist.
No, but I mean, but that's what we're shooting for. Weatherized homes.
I know, but I think you're probably looking at, how many units do you have to do electrification? to retrofit, you're probably talking another 20%,
So,
20 or
Yeah.
30% more, just
Yeah.
because each of those units is not going to be 100%. Some of them will be, but
Right,
I
but
think
this
a
is just
greater
a
majority of
Yeah.
them,
what we need
a
to
greater
go
majority of
on.
them will not be
Look at that.
100%
Yeah.
reduction.
Yeah, but
You know-
this is good.
This,
Yeah.
can I ask a question about
It's
home,
gonna
home reservation?
underestimate it.
Does that include home efficiency?
It will,
Or is that
no,
just
it-
weatherization?
So
No,
when
it's
you
gonna
say home
overest-
efficiency, do you mean like
No.
light bulbs and appliances or,
Yes.
n- no, home weatherization in the model is space heating.
Right,
Okay.
Electric
'Cause-
efficiency doesn't really matter one way or the other.
Yeah,
Right.
because it's
unfortunately.
carbon free.
electric
so
doesn't
I
doesn't
mean-
buy you
That's
anything
right.
anymore.
Yeah,
I-
okay.
I think-
I mean, it is, it isn't.
I
but
think the
guess for this
powerful,
purpose, Okay.
I
I
think
mean,
the
we can talk
Yes,
regionally
yes.
and there's good reasons for it, but model wise.
So-
Yeah, okay.
Not gonna
I,
show
I
up.
think the
Yep.
powerful message here really is to me, is you roughly have to electrify and weatherize half of the homes in South Burlington in 8 years, by 2030. Roughly half of the homes in each of the buckets. Either you do it in combination or do it mutually exclusive. That's what you have to do to get to the target. That's a pretty
That's-
big,
I was comparing this and
Yeah.
I was comparing this with the WPA
yeah.
because in Works Progress Administration, it's that huge a scale of an issue.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because one of the
Yeah.
political candidates was sort of talking about this.
Yeah.
And, I had to admit, it's like, he's absolutely right, without that kind of effort, like publicly
Yeah.
creating entities to go out and weatherize things at the minimum cost, the minimum fuss. That's like the only way you can get to these
Yeah,
numbers.
That's what they're saying. Donna's right. I mean, it has to be a wartime mentality in order to get
Sure.
there.
Sure.
World War
I
Zero.
agree.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the call for it.
Mm.
War zero?
World War Zero.
World net zero.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if we're not electrifying homes or weatherizing homes, then we're putting in the effort in another sector, and that's transportation. And so the VMT reduction that we need to do goes up. Currently, we have it estimated as 2.5%.
It's a lot.
Um,
It's a lot.
It could go up. It will go up beyond that if we lower the electrification effort.
The
In a
third-
rural place, that's gonna be a
lot.
challenge.
The 37.5% EV, that's the entire stock. So when you look at the entire stock of cars or buses, whatever, at 2030, 37.5% will be EV. That's what that means?
Only
Yes.
those that
Yeah.
are being driven.
And that is consistent with the
Doesn't include
state's comprehensive
VMT.
energy plan
in the garage.
of electrifying the light duty fleet as well.
Yeah.
So that's a policy that's already in the plan.
Does the-
And this is focused at the whole population.
Yeah.
This isn't just government, stuff that
No,
you could really.
it's all the
so
residents.
37
No, for-
All the residents.
for-
Can they
for re-
make that money by then?
It's
don't
Hopefully.
know.
I don't know.
It's a lot.
Is there- is there a
I'll just,
trajectory that the model spits out of what percent of new vehicles each year? Because it's gonna change, right? It's not a linear path, right? It'll be 100% of new vehicles in 2030, but only 3% next year or something.
The
right?
output for the forecasting module or the planning module is simply just transportation emissions.
Yeah.
So Melanie, when it shows 37.5% of the vehicles, what do we have a sense as to is that South Burlington taking actions beyond what's going to happen in the background? Or is that like sort of in the business as usual category? Is
I
that
don't think
us doing more than what will happen generally? Or is that sort of what's likely to happen in the industry?
In my mind, I think it's being proactive and doing some of the policies that are already being contemplated. And so that electric vehicle adoption by 2030 is a way of measuring the electric vehicle adoption actions that are in the draft transportation section. So that's doing 200 amp electric service, and working with GMP to develop policy incentives. So, and also, this is kind of a numbers game. What do we have to do on the electric vehicle side to get the reduction down to 60%? So to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Paris Accord, this is the electric vehicle trajectory that we need to be contemplating.
Yeah.
So if we just
So-
bought everybody in South Burlington an electric vehicle,
There you
Yeah.
go.
that's the only one they can drive, then we're
Yeah.
done.
So one column that would be helpful, I don't know how this set of metrics, can be communicated to the rest of the community outside of this room. One column that would be helpful is a baseline. So you have 500 housing units to be electrified annually now, that's the target. I suppose based on what the tracking that has been going on, this number is probably about 100 or 150 today.
Yeah, so it's not apples to apples with the data that we have. So currently South Burlington is seeing about 200 heat pumps installed annually over the last 3 years. I would, and so here we're talking about housing units, and you would need numerous heat pumps to
Sure.
electrify a whole housing unit. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, but I can certainly add that for some context.
I think this goes back to the point of what Tom was trying to say when he made the presentation. Our current adoption rate is something like 2% or something. Benchmark, national standard benchmark is around 4%. And he was putting South Burlington at something like 6% to meet the 2030 target. So I think this has got the flavor of 6%. It's a very high aspirational number. So I think it'll be good to have some baseline for people to look at and say how big a target we are looking at.
Yeah, I hear you. Putting it in totality context makes a lot of sense, and I can certainly do that.
You know,
You mean like using 9,000 houses?
yeah, that's
So
one.
you know
That's
that
one,
would be
but
one
but
reality.
but what Melanie was saying, that even though we are putting 200 heat pumps annual basis,
It's
it
not-
does
It's
not
not
represent the
200.
It's
housing
not
units.
200
Right.
fully
Yeah.
electrified
Exactly,
homes.
exactly.
I mean,
And,
we
and
have
we may
100.
have to take a leap that, we understand that the data has limitations. We may have to just put a big asterisk and say, best guess, 200 heat pumps is 40 or 50 homes a year.
Yeah,
It's better to have something that says
Sure.
we're at about 1/10 of what we need to be
Yeah.
each year than to not present anything at all.
Right.
And then we
Yeah.
just say, it's a wild guess. It might be off by 2 factors. But either way, if we're half as right as we thought, it's still 1/5 of what we need to be doing. So
Look, what these targets are saying, what they said when the first time you presented it, is we need to do everything we possibly can, because there's no way, like, the likelihood we actually meet these targets is like slim to none. So we just need to do everything we possibly can.
yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I guess the one last sector that we haven't talked about is just going down to compact development. So with the additional houses based on population growth, I estimated it being an additional like 27 units. So if those 2,700 units are in areas that are of high density, that provides a reduction of about 5,500 metric tons of CO2 equivalents, which is about 5% of the overall.
We can understand that. How
Reduction.
does that relate to the footnote? I mean, the footnote assumes all new units are carbon free. So is that, does that reduce transportation or?
Carbon free from an electric perspective. And so that compact development measure plays a role in
Transportation?
reducing the transportation
Okay,
emissions.
so that's what it is. It's really a VMT.
Yes.
The compact development is a VMT thing.
Yes,
Okay.
and it's a small portion of the
Yeah.
VMT
Okay.
reduction.
This is an interesting target for the city, because this is what the city is struggling with right now, right? Somewhat the housing issue
Mhm.
all relates to doing something big that is impactful in a number of ways. So I think this is a really good, meaningful number here. to
But so
have.
is this saying that all new development could 27.7, that sounds like between now and 2030?
Yes.
A lot, like all new development needs to
Yes.
be in,
Well,
in this
yeah,
high density. That's what it assumes.
it's not saying that it needs to be, it's
That's
saying
what
that
it's-
if it was,
This is what it
you would
assumes.
get a 5,500
Is that- yeah.
reduction, which is a very small piece of the of the overall reduction.
Yeah.
The other actions, electrification,
Yeah.
electric vehicle adoption, VMT reduction, so that's biking, taking the bus, gives you sort of the biggest bang for your buck.
Yeah.
You're getting
What is
a
12 and
higher
half-
level of reduction from that suite of actions.
What does that look like? Is that like an apartment building or is that still, like, what does that look like? 12.5 units per acre?
No parking.
There's different
Definitely
ways that
not
it could
single family.
be.
Definitely no
In South
parking.
Burlington, it's typically been large buildings.
You
But the
can't
Five
own a car
Sisters
and live
neighborhood of
here.
Burlington is over that also.
Yeah.
So
Or-
there's
or
different
you
ways
can-
that you can do it.
Cars and
Um,
live here.
What did you say, Paul?
Andrew's question was, what does it look like at 12 and a
Yeah.
half units an acre? There's different models of it. I would say, Farrell Street is a little bit over 12 and a half units an acre.
Mm.
That's one model of it. But I would also say the Five Sisters neighborhood of Burlington, which is single families, two families, triplexes, is also over 12 and a half units an acre because they're on small lots and they're compact and then there's a park nearby. So there's different ways of getting at it.
Okay.
But those are a couple of examples. And I
Queen-
think I
Queen City
actually
Park
have
is
a
probably
little
just short.
thing
that.
that I
Five
put together for the
Sisters.
planning.
Sisters.
No,
What-
Queen City
can
and
you-
South Burlington.
Could you add in this
Where's Five
box so it's
Sisters?
really clear
It's the
that
south end.
this
by Pine Street.
reduction due to compact development is related
End
to
of
a
Pine
reduction in vehicle miles
Burlington.
South
traveled
Sure.
Burlington.
Mhm.
That's a good
versus
point, yeah.
electrification or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, otherwise it's,
Capture that elsewhere.
I don't-
I think
I don't
the
know that
more the
area that
public
well.
understands.
So if you,
Why we're,
yeah,
why
Yeah, why
density
that-
is so important.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
so if you look at other.
After you go past the Shelburne roundabout.
They're single family,
If you
small.
if you look at other climate action plans for bigger cities, the concept of compact development and providing public transportation is the core of reducing the carbon footprint for the cities. It's a core initiative. Without that, big cities cannot, even touch some of these targets with the pole. So
Right.
yeah,
Well,
well,
right, so
luckily
when-
for us, we have other levers.
Yeah,
Right. When I look at this, Srini, I look at vehicle miles traveled and reducing it 2.5%. How do you do that? You do that by
Yeah.
having your neighborhood park very close. You do it by having probably a lot of single family homes have an accessory apartment
yeah.
attached to them, and then you are fostering the services to where they're going to walk to a store.
Mhm.
Vehicle miles traveled getting reduced is, some of it is about taking the bus and walking, but a large part of it is where are you walking to and why would you walk that?
Yeah.
Because
But these
there's
are
there's
presented separately here, Paul, right? Because everything you're talking about is in that 5,000 number. And the 23 number is not that.
Not necessarily. I mean, I guess that I guess in my mind, they have to connect together. If people
Yeah.
are going to walk to the store has to have the economic conditions where it can survive being within walking distance. So you may have to have not necessarily 12 and a half units an acre, but a neighborhood seeing more houses being placed in it so that a store feels like it's economically viable. That's kind of where I'm at with this.
But
Is
is
sort of a
the
modeling question.
5,500 already included in the 23,000?
No.
No.
No. I think the 23,000 is for existing people who own vehicles today and who live in South
Right. So,
Burlington.
so implicit then in what Paul's saying for like, then you need to put stores in existing neighborhoods,
Yeah,
Right. And then how do you get that store to?
right?
One is you
That's
enable it, and then two,
Yeah.
we may not have
Yeah.
that development pattern where it can survive yet.
Yeah.
So to me, that's why they're connected, and it
Yeah.
sort of comes back to a smart growth strategy.
sure. Yeah,
Places like the airport deli.
okay.
Okay,
Hard to
so
force that.
Everyone, I'm sorry, I've got a 5:30 flight in the mornings. I just can't stay. I gotta.
So can we do, so,
I got an early thing with a dog. 4:05, so
9:00 already.
just-
Yeah.
should we have a time check
yeah,
conversation
so
or?
time check,
Ted and I alternate.
I know there's some more stuff in the science-based targets. There's also, I think it would be valuable to just quickly vote on the minutes so we can get that, off the agenda and get them out to the public. And then I guess it's a question of whether there's any value in trying to do a quick pass on like the public outreach. If there's, particularly if there's things that we need to be doing between now and the next meeting that we need to take a couple minutes on, and maybe that's something that we can do and catch you up on
Okay.
afterwards, since.
I'm happy to vote in the minutes, but
Perfect.
I've really got to go because otherwise I'm just going to be a zombie.
Yeah,
Okay.
so let's do a quick vote on the minutes. If people need to leave, they can leave, and then we
Okay, you
can.
just need to correct the spelling of my name, and I would move that both sets of minutes be approved.
Can we get a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye, okay, 5.
Thanks,
0
everyone.
approved.
Bill is,
Oh, and Bill, thank you, Bill. Sorry, I missed your thumb there. 6-0.
okay, so we're gonna move to public outreach.
Yeah, well, I guess I would ask, so Melanie, I know you had other things that you wanted to go through there. Is this an okay stopping place to come back and I feel like there's probably some more stuff that you should get to share with us, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a really good discussion about the science-based targets and the scenarios, and I appreciate everybody's questions. You know, we do need to talk about the way to prioritize the actions. And so we did contemplate a process for that. And so that's in the memo. And it explains
Okay.
kind of high impact sectors and the way to look at the actions in terms of high impact actions versus supporting actions. But so I just wanted to give a quick overview of that. But I guess I would defer to Paul on whether we want to table that conversation.
Well, I
or
think
have
if
it
you could
now.
spend 2 minutes on it, because I think that this is the way that, and what's up on the screen here is how you get from this big list
Yeah.
to saying, what are the really
Yes.
big ones? And how do we start to have it look a little bit the way that the Montgomery plan starts to look, which is really sort of punchy and clear, which is part of public outreach. So if you can spend maybe just 2 minutes on it.
Yeah.
Because I
you-
don't think it ultimately it's very controversial as to
No,
what's high
so I
impact.
mean, you said it well. So we have a very large worksheet with numerous tabs covering the different sectors. And so we have suggested a way to get from that worksheet to a draft plan. And so this is the mock-up version of 3 sectors showing how we do that. And so the way we do that is by looking at the science-based targets and understanding from that data, what are the high impact actions that are going to give us the greatest reduction. And so this is the first draft of taking the long list of actions and prioritizing them in such a way for buildings and thermal and transportation, and listing out the high impact actions that get us those large reductions. And we've provided some definitions about what a high impact action is. It's ones that is effective at reducing emissions. They are policy and investment oriented. And then those supporting actions that are educational and promotional that support the high impact actions, but they're not necessarily quantifiable and aren't going to give us the biggest bang for our buck and the reductions.
Right. And would we delete all of the others?
So that's a really good question. We would not delete them. The way I see it, as they would be in an appendix,
An appendix.
and then
fine.
each one identified as either a high impact action or a supporting action. And then the high impact actions that are kind of up front and center are the focus, the priority focus of the climate action plan that gets presented to the city council and is the next steps for implementation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the others are still extremely valuable, but they don't become the core policy things that the council is achieving, but they may be an implementation thing that the
Sure.
rec department is doing, or that the, fire
Exactly.
department is doing,
No, I
or
think
what
this
have.
is very good. No, you've
Yeah.
done a really nice job.
Well, my partner here.
Yeah.
Oh, so sorry.
And there is gonna be a designer who will make this look beautiful too. These are
Okay.
just
Nice.
mock-ups.
Nice.
So just a couple of comments. So before we get to this, by the way, excellent work on the inventory. I mean, things are really coming together. Don't get discouraged by all the detailed questions. I mean, I think there is a lot of good stuff here that people need to understand. So on this one, the high impact actions, they are traceable to the numbered actions in the each of the pathways, or
Mhm.
or have you like,
We haven't touched the language.
okay, just so they're
Yeah.
traceable, okay. Okay, good.
So this is the opportunity to answer the questions that came up in the earlier presentation.
Yeah.
You know, like a lot of these individual high impact actions. It's not like you want to get into long descriptions, but you want to make sure it's really clear,
Yeah,
you know, what the assumption, you know, just so it's clear.
yeah,
You know, where it wasn't clear at all before. Here, you can add a few more words to make really clear what you mean. Like, for instance, um, well, prevent fossil fuel thermal in new buildings. You know, like that has to agree with, you know, the earlier thing, or like, you know, in residential buildings or versus commercial, and it's 80%.
Yeah, this is where we're
reduction.
talking about the ordinance.
Right.
Yeah, we never got that specific in the actions because that was way back when.
Right.
And you guys have evolved since then. So yeah, we could certainly update that with where you're at now
Yeah.
with that one.
And I assume each one of the high impact actions is going to have a more detailed description later on in the document, right? Is that a safe assumption, or is that something that would be not part of
Yeah.
this plan, but part of the implementation?
Yeah,
plan?
so that is exactly the way the Montgomery
Right.
plan works, is that each of these, we would see it as each of these actions gets a little description.
Right.
Right.
However, getting really deeply into that, the way the Montgomery plan does, isn't part of the scope of our
Right,
work,
I think,
but
Right.
I want to be jealous of, protecting the scope here with our partners at the CCRPC, but to me, this is a one pager and then something that briefly discusses each of these and then shows the list of all the other ones is achieving a big part of what you
Yeah.
were asking for. And I think it also shows how you're closer to the finish line than maybe you felt that you are. That, giving them some time, you can be doing some public outreach over the next month and a half. Maybe, we're gonna ask Melanie and Ann to not come for a couple of meetings and just work on putting this together. If you're feeling after your next meeting that, you're kind of there,
I
let
think
them
as
go
long
and
as they're
prepare a
sending
report.
us-
Yeah.
As long as they're sending us the updates.
Well, I guess
they're
what I'm
sending
saying
us
is,
the
I think what
updates
I
and
would
we can
do
see
is,
where they're
I'm
at.
not gonna put them on a 1 week cycle.
Right.
Give them a month to go work on it and then
Right.
come back, because that's the challenges, they've got
Sure.
lots of projects on their plate.
Well,
And so
the-
as a consultant, give them a little bit of time to write something as a draft up.
Even as they're completed, it still gives us an opportunity to read through and make minor edits. We're not talking major things. We're just, maybe minor edits.
I guess I would vote for not adding a whole lot of language to that sheet,
Mm,
because I think, I thought one of the uses for this is to engage the public in conversations. And if you have a paragraph
yeah,
on
No,
every
right.
single item, then it sounds like, so what input do you want from me? How can I be creative?
Good point.
Well, I think, right, I
think
agree.
somewhere
agree with
we
that.
certainly, it's great to let people know that your work and our discussions contemplated a deeper analysis of these.
Yeah.
But that's not, I didn't think, that's not this.
People are more likely to read
This is-
this
Yeah,
than they
yeah.
are more than this.
And
Right.
some will go to the appendices to
Right.
get more information. But I think you really want this kind of clean and mean, and
yeah,
the
Yeah,
big.
it'll
the-
be a really small percentage of people like us,
Right.
smarty pantses, that are
Yeah.
gonna wanna go into the appendix
Yeah.
and see all that.
This is what Ann had sent over to me. This is what Montgomery County, Maryland has
Yeah.
done. Maryland, right? This is essentially the page we just looked at.
Yeah.
And then they've got a little write-up
yeah,
that accompanies it.
Right.
But if you're a user, most users stop at page 1, which
Sure.
is what it's supposed to be.
Sure.
And then this is a little, probably a
Yeah.
little more detailed than we would do, but
yeah,
something that explains in our case, what is it?
yeah,
What is a 2030, what is it called, a 2030
District.
district?
Thirty
Yeah.
What is a 2030 district? as a little, one paragraph.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I have just one other little one, which is on the transportation one. In the very first sentence, first paragraph, you talk about until EVs are broadly adopted. Until then, South Burlington will promote and encourage bike, walking, transit. No, we'll always encourage that.
Good point.
We will always
True.
encourage that.
Yes, yes.
So
Maybe you
I
could
would
say
just-
while
While-
EVs are
While, there you
getting
go.
broadly adopted.
but we're always going to want to encourage it.
Yeah,
Even
South
if everybody
Burlington will
has an
continue
EV,
to promote.
Yeah.
electric vehicle, if they could walk.
That's
someplace,
a
we'd
good
like to.
edit. That had to do with the fuel efficiency at the bottom, so I'll rewrite that.
Okay, thanks.
The only other comment I would make is from a process point of view, I'm not sure what type of quality engagement we are going to get from the public on these specific things. Some of the high impact actions may get debated or they may suggest some other things
That's fair, yeah.
that may percolate up. So I don't know what level of engagement we're
Yeah,
going to get.
I've
so-
been giving a lot of thought to that, and
Yeah.
I'm starting with some conversations with Ethan, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, from Keith and the Energy Committee, and I think that realistically, that
Yeah.
we can do some surveying kind of thing, but the conversations out at various events, which is a big part of this,
Mhm.
is really going to be back at the level of the charts that Melanie showed before in a very clean way.
Yeah.
What do we need to do? 500 homes is what it's looking like. Have you ever thought about weatherizing your home? What do you think about, how could we do a reduction in vehicle miles? The type of feedback that you're going to get is probably not going to be, let's do 6% vehicle miles traveled instead of 4%. It's more, I see this
Sure.
as you might get some really good new ideas of things that you hadn't thought of.
Yeah,
The person who attended one of the meetings said, what if we had a thing where if you had one of 3 different things you did on your property, and then we had lawn signs to celebrate
Yeah.
that, I've weatherized my home. I think that's the kind of feedback that you'll get. And you might get education, I think, is the other part of
Sure.
it that you're going to
Okay.
get of,
Okay.
And we really are going to have to talk about how we're going to make this equitable and how we're going to help the people who cannot afford to weatherize and will never afford an electric vehicle until the prices come remarkably down. So,
Yeah, and we want to work on some language around that.
yeah, we really have to talk about that. We keep not getting there because it's always the last item in our agenda and we never get. to
It's
that.
hard, it's hard. Melanie and I got started on that process. It's
It's
very
very hard.
complex. It's very hard.
And you can see why the state plan, they never got to it.
Well, and so in the memo, we do talk about the need to do the prioritization. It sounds like we have agreement that this approach works. And so we can take a look at the high impact actions and identify how to potentially edit or enhance the language so that the language and the actions that get implemented are equitable. We've had some conversations with VHFA about affordability and energy efficiency, so have some ideas there that can help, especially in the buildings and thermal section.
Right.
And then also taking in consideration the state's just transition scoring rubrics from the climate action plan, and just taking that principle and that concept and just bringing it right into this plan so that in the implementation phase, those equity principles are embedded in the implementation, because
Right.
it's really hard to get at equity at the action level. And that, so I think that when the implementation plan starts to get going, then that's really where the equity piece
Yeah.
is considered, and the scoring rubric might make more sense at that level.
And we
But
can-
having those principles in the plan, I think really sets up a good foundation.
point.
I think there is, in terms of public outreach, I'm surprised that nobody at city council, nobody in the city, none of the representatives have done this, is put an article in the paper telling people that if you have income of less than like $45,000 a year and you have a home, that you qualify for the weatherization assistance program, and that everything they come in and do is free. Nobody's telling anybody this. I told my friend who just retired a few years ago, doesn't have that much income. And they're coming out and he actually has 2 units. And they're going to fully weatherize the entire house at no cost.
Awesome.
And nobody seems to know this.
Right.
Nobody seems to be aware of this.
But on the other hand, they have.
They
more-
have
more projects
limited
in the-
number of
they have
people.
more projects in the queue that they can possibly handle. So every time we offer to help get the word out, they say,
Please
Thank-
don't.
thanks so much, but it's
Until
really
we
not
can hire
helpful.
more people. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's why there's not more promotion of it, is because
Yeah.
that, you know, what VGS told us yesterday is that they did a targeted promotion to low income
Mhm.
and it was phenomenally successful. And now they've gone from a 3-month lag to get your inspection to a 5-month lag.
Yeah.
Oh my
So
gosh.
That's still pretty good though.
Yeah.
That's 5 months for an inspection. I mean, considering the 500 units that have to be weatherized or 600, that's still not bad.
No.
what does it
But-
tell us
but
anything
we
about the
need-
throughput? It just.
But yeah,
Definitely need more
but
workers.
the public may
though,
not
and
think
Sure.
that's terrific.
that goes back to whole bunches of other
months.
issues.
So the one observation that I would make to tie this back to some of the public outreach is that some of the things that we're talking about sound like, you know, I think sometimes in our head, when we've talked about public outreach, it's sort of the positive side of like, let's tell you what's going on and ask you how you want to be part of it. I think there's another aspect of public outreach that we might want to try to design, which is if we want to make sure that we're identifying the barriers, then we should make sure to be listening really carefully in public outreach to when people say, oh, I can't do that.
Exactly.
Why can't you do that? Like, not to try to talk them out of it,
Right.
but to make sure that we're actually listening and
Right.
recording and finding out like what are the barriers, because those are opportunities, right? If we want to be contributing to making this work better and figure out what policies and investments we can make, hearing directly from people about why they're not doing it today is our best cue for how we can change that.
Right. Well, that's a great point, and I think that, you know, it'll be incumbent on us as we're hearing that information to say, what changes this plan and what changes the way in which we implement it?
Yeah.
Because the plan to convert 600 homes a year to weatherize can still be the plan,
Oh, yeah,
but the
yeah,
obstacles identified as to how to do it might
Totally.
be altered. So
totally.
making sure that we're getting input and using it both for today and this plan, and then identifying the future and working with all of our partners who've been doing this for decades and understand a lot of these challenges. Yeah.
So to Ethan's point, I just wonder, I know that survey is probably something that the city is using for other initiatives. Something like this, would an open house post-recession be helpful with people who are able to talk through some of these concepts and listen independently and take notes and
Maybe if you went to their neighborhood.
I think
Hard to
the
get
conversations
I
are
don't think
mostly
they're
about
gonna come
doing
here.
outbound listening sessions. So going to different
Yeah.
events
You have to go to them.
and
Mhm.
having a tent or walking around with a clipboard or something like that. And
like
but so I think
different events as in, I don't know what the other
Oh,
events are.
stuff at the Memorial Park, you know.
Right, a lot
they
of what
have
we've been
the-
looking at is sort of individual outreach of
I
going
see.
to the food trucks at Memorial
Oh,
Park.
I see. Food
Going
trucks.
to the, we do barbecues with Champlain Housing Trust,
I
so we're
see.
getting low income families
I
and
see.
hearing from them.
Good one.
But, you know, there could also be value in at least doing one thing where we have folks come here. I'm always a little bit reticent because us and every other community in the country tends to get the same
Right.
sort of
Exactly.
35 people, but maybe that's still 30 more people than are in this room. And it's
Well,
an opportunity at least to say, we've got a draft. Here's our best ideas. We're ready to hear, you know, what do you think about?
Yeah, what
all
have we
this.
forgotten or missed?
And I mean, I think the assumption is that if we do the inbound where we say, come, you know, give up a night and come to us, we're probably going to get the biggest advocates and the people who are most bought in already,
Right.
which is fine though. Like we want to make sure that they know that this is happening and can be part of it. Just that that's not the beginning and end of the outreach, right? We don't
We
want
have
to
to
just
do
hear
both.
from.
I'm
yeah.
just saying that there is value in doing this formally at the city hall and then doing the outreach as well.
Yeah.
I think there's value because it's an important milestone. It's an important milestone. People are going to remember.
Yeah.
So
Well,
can
and to
vo-
me,
co-
I think it's when Melanie and Ann put together these
Yeah.
one pagers,
yeah,
that's clicked in of,
sure,
I frankly was a little lost before this as to how do we take
sure.
11 pages worth of actions and have people come to it. So maybe at 3 pages that we can blow up,
Yeah,
we can have something that is
sure.
in the realm of digestible for
Yeah.
folks.
But have you thought about doing things like I don't know, a hot diggity dog, free hot dog party in the Chamberlain district.
Right.
So yes, and what?
Out things.
so
Do
y-
you need help with this? Here, here,
Well,
it's, you know.
So yes,
go
in
there.
that we're building on programs in the rec department that they're already doing, so that we're not creating a new one. It is a barbecue with Champlain Housing Trust at some of their neighborhoods.
Right.
I think we're not, I hadn't yet been in the place of, here's the materials to implement, because I was in the mindset of the plan.
Mhm.
But if we do have, if we can take all of this and say, what's the one thing that you'd like to leave with residents instead of a stack of handouts, I'd be all for it.
Yeah.
Free weatherization.
Well, maybe that's something we partner with CVOEO and we say, would you give us a stack of something, or possibly have somebody come to us and talk with people while we're doing the input. Here's the number one thing that you can do. I think that's a great idea.
Paul,
And some
an
employment
idea
applications
about
at the
a way
same
to,
time.
Yeah.
I guess, compartmentalize the sectors. Like, for example, when you're meeting with Champlain Housing Trust, one thing that we learned from talking with VHFA is that a lot of the existing affordable housing stock is very energy efficient and already being weatherized. So maybe talk with them about transportation
Right.
and
Well-
not buildings and thermal.
Right. And just to be clear, when I say with Champlain Housing Trust, I don't mean the staff. I mean the
Right.
people who live in the
Yes.
buildings that they
Right.
manage, where we're doing barbecues. Because to me, when we talk about equity,
But
we
I-
have much fewer.
Yes, but her,
touches.
I
your
would
point
guess that
is
they're
yes,
more
well taken.
challenged by transportation and
Yep.
then buildings and thermal,
Great point.
for example.
And and many of them might not own the building.
Right,
So
right. So just thinking about ways to just fine tune the outreach a little bit.
But just to make sure that we're remembering, my understanding has been that the primary purpose of the outreach is not necessarily to go out and tell people, we figured it all out and we're telling you what you need to do, right? That this is supposed to be a listening session and saying, we've been thinking about the problem, we have a description of the problem, we think we have some understanding of some of the components of it, and we want to hear your response.
Yeah.
Does this reflect what you're understanding? Have we missed some things? Do you have concerns about how we've framed this up? Right? And not saying this is done and now you just need to do
right.
it.
Yes.
Not
I-
bad to give
right,
out.
I would say
information.
yes, and it's a lot, if we go out into the community, it's a lot of individual conversations where it's not necessarily, what do you think of this document? It's more, hey, we've got this massive challenge in front of us. That's looking, we're gonna need to do 70% reduction. Our top 2 or 3 ideas are this. What do you think? I think it's gonna be some of those kinds of grassroots education, because it's either we bring people here and we do something formal, or we go out and we have much more informal conversations that as a whole bring everybody up.
This is, I think, one of the dangers of having just the high level actions, because when I do this, I go out and I talk to people about things that can be done. The ones that come to mind usually first, put on solar panels. Okay, we don't mention that anywhere in here because that's an energy production issue, and it's not even mentioned in this high level stuff.
Does it
It's
net us
electric,
anything?
It is-
electric lawnmowers
We're just
aren't
looking
at all
3
mentioned
sectors
here.
There will be a renewable energy generation page similar to this. We just
Okay.
are just showing you,
They haven't gotten it all done. in
Yeah,
other
Okay,
words.
that
We've
one's
got
not, that
quite a
one's
few
not done.
pathways.
But the electric lawnmowers, some of those that are not going to be major things, but they're definitely the sort of things that
Mhm.
normal people are thinking about doing right now. The electric cars, some people would, they're definitely aspiring to them, but they don't see it in their immediate future. And so you have to understand that these high level actions are probably going to get people saying, it may even overwhelm them. And yet, we're not really discussing all of those other measures that we did come up with that are minor ones, which is more where most people are at.
Well, maybe
So
we
how
think
do you
about
bridge
a little,
that?
a little handout, a little one pager that's like
Mhm.
big policy things. What is your feedback? Medium things that are a major life investment for you, and small things. And we want people to be proud of also thinking about switching over to an electric lawnmower, because everything needs to be done.
Right.
Mhm.
Well,
So
and I'm
maybe it's-
thinking like a one-page thing that lists every one of the things and the typically, how much carbon reduction you're going to have. It could be a one-page thing, just so people understand that we need to look at the ones at the top of this list to
Right, but-
meet these goals versus the ones that are more doable but are toward the bottom of the list.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is as public outreach, people should feel good and that they do have a role to play in this. So I don't want to say
Sure.
it's a minor thing, because if somebody's only thing they can do this year is to invest in an electric lawnmower, they
Right,
should be,
right.
celebrated for doing that. And
Right.
then maybe they'll think about a car, and then maybe they'll think about writing to a city councilor about a policy on something big that can be done.
I
And-
think that the chart that shows all the goals and really makes the case
Mm.
for why this is so important to achieve, that these goals are monumental, and this is, if we do nothing, we're just falling further and further behind. I think there are some groups where that would be really an important presentation, to sort of have them not just look at the actions, but sort of have that fundamental understanding, whether it's the SBBA or the Rotary or people that
Garden
have,
Club.
heard about this, and maybe some of them even think it's, not real.
Mhm.
And but you make the case
Club,
for
yeah.
South Burlington, both business and residential. And I mean, I think that is important as well, the two charts. And not the only thing to do, but I think that's a way to start the conversation with some of the people who probably can afford to get the electric car.
Yeah.
I mean, that's on their horizon.
Yeah.
Or all, turn their house into heat pump land.
Yeah.
Whereas other people, it's buying LED lights or,
So maybe an action to be done, and I'm not sure exactly in the timing, but to have a very tight, clear, good little package of information that you all, your partners on the energy committee, and then hopefully many more people can then go and speak to all these groups and really, you've got one little, whether it's a PowerPoint or a little handout or whatever it is, with the key points, looks great. Then we can go to the Rotary Club and talk about it. We can talk with
yeah.
whoever your organization of 10 people in a household and on a block party, whatever it might be.
And
Yeah.
I really
And
like that.
I think one comment about the graphics on here, I think you need to have graphics that are more effective in showing like where we are, where we need to be.
Mm.
Because these little, it sort of works, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't really have much impact.
I think they're gonna have a design team work on the
Right.
graphics, right? to
Yeah,
make it
so
more-
getting the graphics,
Yeah,
message
yeah.
across graphically will be
Mhm.
super important.
But I mean, I think this is a terrific start.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
oh, absolutely.
You did a great
It-
job.
It worked
Yeah.
really well.
Yeah.
I just think, remember we had that sort of dog and pony show when we were selling City Center,
Right. Yeah,
and I
clear, graphic,
think there were
visual.
like 5 of us. We had great graphics, and there were 5 people who, each had sort of one little part of it. We went to, I don't know how many, we went to a lot of meetings, and I mean, it's just another way to get the community sort of understanding and then take it from there.
Yeah.
It sort of generated
I
some,
mean,
Make a big difference.
I think it will.
Yeah, there's-
You go to a PTA or something.
There's a lot of levels with this. This is just the perfect high level information. The second level information, I'm not sure at what point that information comes out, but it's the one I get asked all the time. And, people don't realize you can lease solar panels. What are the economics of this? What is the economics of weatherization? How much money will I save? It's like, there's no guarantees on it, but you can say on average, this is what's achieved and everything, because people really have no idea that you can save 50%, just by doing a really good weatherization.
Well, what I hear from people who've done it is that they're so much more comfortable in their home
Right,
as well.
right.
It, in the heat and the cold.
Yeah.
And I'm told it's a big difference. You'll
Yeah.
be really
Some
happy with
people are
the
more
result.
motivated by the comfort. Some people are really motivated by the money. They tend to live together and they argue all the time, but you know.
So can I remind one, and I know we need to wrap up because we're at 9:30 now. But one other thing that I think we should think about as we're designing the public outreach is we've talked a lot about how individuals can do individual actions and that messaging. There's a key piece of this that we were struggling with earlier tonight about getting support from the public for policy changes. And a lot of the things that are the most impactful about what the city is actually going to be able to accomplish with this are policy changes. And if we need to be able to get 5,000 people to come out and vote yes for new ordinance, or vote yes for a bond to go and finance a bunch of low income projects or things like that, I think that's sort of a key thing. And so, yeah, there's part of a message that's coming out and saying you need to do a thing and here's why. But I think there's also a really important message that we can get out there and say, we're all trying to do this thing together. Please join us and be part of making South Burlington better. And I think that that's a really important opportunity that we should think about. How do we get that in there and how do we get that? Because I think it'll be easier once that, if you get people on board of like, oh, we're all going to be part of doing this thing, then following up with, and what small thing can you do as well yourself? That's great to have as part of it. And I know there's different theories of change about, do you get someone first to come over and realize that they're part of the tribe, and then what do they do as together as a tribe, or which comes first? But we need to get both of them accomplished. So we can all think about like, how do we bring that piece in?
Well, and to Helen's point, if we're talking about things that ultimately take voter action, there's a grassroots element to it, and then there's a communicating with people who are neighborhood leaders and having them filter information. So when we speak with, whether it's the Rotary Club or a garden club, that tends to be a way that you can get
Yeah.
people who are leaders in their own neighborhoods or their own areas to then sort of advocate, so that that's the other part of something like
Yeah,
this.
and don't forget the condo association managers can really, they know who the people are who were the leaders in the community, because they're the ones that manage the communities. I mean, that's a good way to get to these larger condo communities, which are hard to get to.
Can I put out a request then in that vein? Because one challenge that we were bumping up against in the Energy Committee last night, as we talked about how we could help support this and do some of the outreach and try to understand where are those points of contact, was we were wishing that there was like the list of all the organizations, the civic organizations in South Burlington, so that we could divvy it up and start going down and calling all the people. And no one knew of any extant list like that. And I don't think there is one, but what occurred to us is that maybe this is something that a bunch of us who are thinking about how can we help get this organized, is that can be one of the early steps, is just start crowdsourcing, brainstorming an idea and trying to figure out like, what are the religious organizations? What are the different housing based organizations? What are,
Get on Google.
right. So, but there's, right.
It's like one way, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So there like a bunch of searching, and also someone came up with a great idea, which is as we start to go out and talk, make sure to ask folks who are involved, like, what other organizations are you involved in? Like, who else should we be talking to, and make sure to bring them back. So I think that that's one thing that we can all start to work
Yeah.
on together, is just like build that list. And then once we have all these great materials and a, cadence going, then we know like, how do we ramp it up and get it out there, and who else can we call on and ask to help, maybe train more people. I mean, the 10 of us and the Energy Committee
Well, and
cannot go and do
I
all
think
of this.
especially if you put this idea and then you make it this isn't a summer fall of 2022 project, it's a summer fall of 2022 through the next 15 years
Yeah.
of ongoing reaching out and building community. I mean, I think that, that's to a certain extent what's been happening in Burlington with Burlington Electric. This is not this ordinance passed recently, but it's been a multi-year community conversation that is building to where
Yeah.
there's a strong sense of community, of identity. And that's, I think, what you're talking about ultimately here. There's a question just before we, Roseanne asked if she could make a comment before we wrapped up tonight. So whenever you get to that.
Sure.
Look, I just want to make this general comment. I've been part of big customer engagement, employee engagement initiatives. The important thing is have the content very simple. Spend 10-15 minutes on the content and have more conversations after the content. It
Mhm.
can't be 45 minutes of content and 15 minutes of conversation. It's got to be 15 minutes of content, 45 minutes of conversation.
Right.
And you probably have to do it a couple of times.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
It's people don't digest this kind of stuff readily. So you have to spend time. So I would
Yeah.
say from my experience, you probably need like a bunch of lieutenants, about 10, 15 people out in the field, having a lot of small conversations to spread the message over a period of 3 to 6 months.
I
to
assume
do
the
this.
analog.
Hmm?
I assume the analog to that, sorry, is that if you're having a 5-minute conversation with someone at an event, it's 1 minute of talking and 4 minutes of listening,
Exactly.
right?
So I would say just, it's not, you're right. It's not a 1-month effort. It's,
Right.
so.
Yeah, great point.
And
Thank you.
And I think the data that is
Yeah.
specific to South Burlington,
Yeah,
because I mean, you talk about global warming and stuff, oh, what could this community do? What can Vermont do with such a little?
Right.
And so I think when it's down to the level of, well, this is quote, our contribution to, you know, how many metric tons, as well as, and these are the contributions that if we keep the land open and the forests intact and the wetlands and all that stuff, we are making a difference. Those are, that's data that I think helps people make the commitment to, oh, okay, I guess I can do something.
Right.
You know, as a
Right.
community, it's not gonna solve it for the world,
Sure.
but it's our little contribution.
Well, and understanding the percentage, because I have had people quote to me things that were completely off base. You know, it's like, oh, our energy usage is really minimal compared with other countries. And I'm like, that is
kidding?
not true. That
Minimal, do
is
you mean 5X?
that is absolutely not true.
Because we're the best
News
at
station
everything.
You listen to, I guess.
That is really not true. And have proof of that, you know?
yeah.
So let me put one question out and then we'll let Roseanne speak, which is that, so sort of spill over from conversation last night with the Energy Committee. Some of you are aware that there's a pilot that's kicking off. My company, Powered City, is doing a software pilot to help support this process and do a tracking dashboard for the CO2 that'll
Oh, that's
continue
really
on past that. Yep. We signed the contract now. We need to move on to the kickoff. And so one of the things that I'm doing now to prepare for the kickoff is try to figure out who wants to be involved in that. Paul, I'm assuming you're on the short list because you're right in the middle of all this. So hopefully we can talk and find schedule. Melanie and Anne, obviously, I want to talk to you guys and find out if you can be part of that or how you want to be involved. But you know, the whole task force is, I know, very interested.
Describing.
Yeah, do you have like a little bit more background on
Yeah.
what this is about?
That
would
That'd be helpful. That'd be
One
helpful.
pager, yeah.
That'd be helpful.
It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone needs to be at the kickoff, right? We can have stuff elsewhere, but I just wanted to like make people aware of that, and it's starting soon, and try to figure out how we can integrate this with all the other things so that it's not like off in left field. And
So is it supporting the CCTF or is it supporting the city?
well, ultimately, it's supporting the city, right? The idea is that it's a pilot of something that
Okay.
could live on. I mean,
Okay, so it's a city
if
project.
we're going to be working on this for the next 30 years and tracking
see.
our
Okay.
progress,
Okay.
we can't do these sporadic, you know, one-off, like that's our history so far of doing climate tracking is different groups at different times do different techniques.
Sure.
And we're struggling already to figure out what's happened in the last 15 years since the idea here is
Right.
put
Okay.
some standards in place and make it easy so that we can do the work.
It's the subject of climate action, not the climate action task force per se.
Right.
Is
Right.
this- Is this the one that
Long-term.
VGBN put out?
It's not the one that anyone put out because it doesn't,
It's not out.
it's not out.
Oh, okay. Because
Yeah.
there's,
Let's
because
hear
there's.
it from
yeah, okay.
Roseanne so we can.
Yeah,
go,
yeah.
Okay.
"Oh,
good
Yes.
idea.
Thanks for being patient, Roseanne.
Want to hear what the.
We all missed the
I want
hearings.
to
Yeah, I
hear
know.
what's going on in Washington.
Oh,
tonight.
right.
Yeah.
Washington.
Did you say
recorded
now?
it.
Yeah, you're free to
on.
talk, Roseanne. Thanks.
Oh, okay. First of all, you've
Alright.
made so many of the points I was going to make, but this is probably, I think, the most beneficial meeting I've attended on the climate issue. One of the things that, well, I'll say in reverse order, what Helen just said is that, you know, making this so that people feel empowered. Because if it's so huge, it just leads to despair and discouragement and nothing happening. But characterize as this is what we in South Burlington can do as a community if we work together, and the city's going to do its part, and we all have a part to play. And sort of like what you're talking, like Burlington has been doing that. And then when Paul said earlier was something I was going to say, this is not just one time, this is a going on forever kind of thing. And so it's not just, this is the task force, this is the objectives, we're going to get your feedback, and then we're going to do something, and then we'll all go home and, nothing, and let it be. I really think this, to get momentum, this has to be an ongoing thing, whether you create another committee or which, I don't know, no one wants more committees. But, a climate activist kind of group in the city that will spin off of this to keep everybody engaged and enthused. And also the idea of making it as simple as possible with simple terms, short stuff. Those of us that read stuff, we'll read all that. But if you really want to attract people, it has to be in really lay terms, in things that will make them feel part of the process, and part of the solution. So, and I think going out, I think you ought to go to every single committee on the, in the city, to the business groups, to the Rotary, every the land trust, every organization, to get everybody involved so that they feel part of it as opposed to being spoken to or directed to. And as far as going out, I know it's expensive, but you should get like an ice cream truck or something, go to Stonehenge, go to Fairland, travel around. That'll get people out, to come and listen. And as far as the equity piece, I know the Vermont, had a hard time getting that. And I think you got to go to where they are. They're not going to be coming to you. So, go to the food shelf, and put posters up and stuff about, so anyway, I think you're doing fabulous work. I'm so heartened that so many of you are so committed to doing this. And I'm really optimistic that South Burlington can do more, and will do more. So thank you so much.
Thanks for those words. And thanks for your consistent attendance and being here to give us feedback. Appreciate it. I think we're adjourned. I think that's the agenda. Thank you.
Do it.